The more I read and travel, the more I realize that the world is changing all the time and everything around us is recent. We look at Falana and we look at Dhimkana and it feels like they've been around forever. But no, both Falana and Dhimkana were born yesterday. Both Falana and Dhimkana did not exist 2 days ago. In fact, they would have seemed radical, even ridiculous as a conception. Look at law firms, for example. The landscape of law in India today, especially corporate law, is centuries removed from how it looked 30 years ago. Today's episode is about the one firm that changed everything. It was founded 26 years ago, adopting a partnership model that was new to India and would have felt so out of place. Today, Trilegal is perhaps the biggest law firm in the country. And this episode is not just about law, it's about upending the status quo, it's about leadership and trust, it's about companies and people and ecosystems, it's about a changing India. And my guest today is one of the founders of this firm, a fine lawyer, a good human being, a clear thinker, India's best Jaitley.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Akshay Jaitley, a founder of Trilegal, who now also runs Trustbridge, which he talks about in this episode. Akshay has been on the show before to discuss his life and to discuss his ideas around policy. I invited him back now to discuss his new and excellent book, Trilegal, which chronicles how this extraordinary firm was set up and how it succeeded. In the space of 2.5 decades, Trilegal disrupted and then dominated the Indian legal space. And I found the story of how it happened to be super insightful, not just for those interested in law, but for anyone interested in how companies work and how incentives can be aligned through designing structure. Much fun came. You must buy the book. You must listen to this episode. But first, I must take a commercial break. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just a willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Akshay, welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks, Amit. Good to be back.
So I think we last recorded in 2022, if memory serves me right. So it's like 3.5 years at least. What have you been up to in the meantime?
I've been up to quite a lot. It feels like I've started a new career almost. I rejoined Trilegal, which is the firm that I helped to start in the year 2000. We started an organization called Trustbridge along with Karan Singh, who was one of the founders of Trilegal as well. We co-founded it, and our common friend Renuka Sane came on to lead the organization. And Trustbridge works on rule of law as it relates to the economy. The idea being that economic reform is all well and good, but you have to do it in accordance with the principles of the rule of law. Otherwise, you're trying to fix the symptoms of problems and not going to root causes. And the idea is how do you show through evidence, through interdisciplinary research with law, economics, and data, that doing the right thing in terms of rule of law is also good for the economy. And sometimes you have to encourage people to take a slightly medium-term, longer-term view, but sometimes you can almost show that results can be pretty immediate. So our focus is trying to work with the regulatory state, since about 75% of the economy is under some regulator or the other, and regulators function in a very different way compared to many other kinds of organizations. So that's the focus of what Trustbridge is doing. We've grown to about 25 people, and I'm also doing sort of lots of policy work on my own as well.
Let's double click on that a bit. Like when you talk about the principles of the rule of law, like this was something that I was going to explore anyway while talking about your journey as a lawyer. My memory is so poor, I've forgotten if we brought it up in our last episode. But the question that often intrigues me is that at one level, when you're a lawyer, what you're really engaged with is understanding the law and figuring out how to navigate it on behalf of your clients and how to optimize for the client according to what the law is. But at another level, there's perhaps a part of your brain which is thinking, which is asking the normative question: what should the law be? And getting a little meta and all of that. And I wonder that as one progresses down one's journey as a lawyer, do you sort of lose sight of the bigger questions? And in this case, it would seem that your founding Trustbridge is actually centered around the bigger questions. What should the law be like? Like, where is our law and where is our policy ecosystem deviating from what you call the principles of the rule of law? So just elaborate on that for me. How do you understand the rule of law? What do you mean by the principles of the rule of?
I think that actually I've seen this happen in the reverse way with many people, which is that when you're younger, you're dealing with the tools of the trade, which is the law. And as you said, you're fashioning solutions for clients around what the law is, because those are the cards that you've been dealt. But for me in particular, and I think for many people, if you work in a field of law where there is a lot of policy implication and energy and infrastructure, my area of practice is full of policy, you sort of realize that what you're doing very often is the quote unquote law that you're structuring around or you're helping your clients work with isn't the optimal version of itself. And it could be a lot better. And I would much rather not be charging clients to structure around what exists. I'd much rather be doing more and more transactions, which I'm convinced would happen if the law was easier to navigate. So that's the sort of, I think a lot of lawyers, and it comes through pattern recognition. So a lot of lawyers recognize these patterns over the hundreds of transactions they do, and they say, okay, why am I doing some of the stuff that I'm doing? Could the system itself be better? And that's why you'll see a lot of lawyers, as they become more senior, they start doing policy related work. So most people tend to do it in their individual capacity, but some people will do it in a more structured institutional sense, and that's what Trustbridge is about. By rule of law, it's what you mean is that if the law says something, then you should do whatever it is that you want to do in accordance with that. That's the very fundamental understanding. So it embodies within it the ideas of predictability, of transparency, of accessibility. You have to know what the law is. It has to be available for you to be able to follow it. I know there's this presumption in most common law countries that ignorance of the law is not an excuse. But what is causing that ignorance? Is the law freely available so that people have they chosen to avoid knowing about the law? Is it just hard for them to know? And in our country, where we have statutes, we have the constitution above everything else, then we've got statutes. Below that, you've got policies, guidelines, then you have notifications, you have office orders, you have memos, and sometimes these are not accessible, and even on the websites of the organizations that are issuing them. So then to ask a citizen or a corporation to follow that is in some sense against the rule of law, because you don't know what the law is. So it's all of these elements which lend themselves to a better functioning economy. That's the sort of principle behind what we're doing.
And does good law emerge from the bottom up or from the top down? Like from the top down, it can come from a set of higher principles, and then from that you arrive at what the law should be from some greater notion of individual rights and autonomy and the state's role and all that. Or you can arrive at it from the bottom up by thinking about what works, for a stable society or a prosperous society or whatever. What is therefore the correct way to think about it?
I don't know if it's necessarily one or the other. I don't think that any system is going to be sustainable or predictable or consistent if it doesn't have a set of principles or values top down guiding it. But I think the expression of those values in any particular society or in any country, I think, should be dictated by what's coming from the bottom up. So the manner in which you implement those values should necessarily differ. They won't apply in the same way in Sweden as they would in India, and there are political economies in India which have to be dealt with, and you can either look to change the political economy and then implement a law, or you can look at taking the political economy as given, and then saying, okay, what is the version of those principles that would fit within this political economy. You might never get a perfect answer, but I think you have to be thinking of both to get a law which is both sustainable in principle as well as in practice. So I think both are critical.
You mentioned about how the task of persuading people to make their laws better is also demonstrating that it's good for the economy in the long run. And I agree with you that a good, strong rule of law will always be good for the economy and society in the long run. But, as a hypothetical, what if it wasn't? Would you still try to push your notion of what a rule of law would be, even if you can't necessarily show good outcomes down the road? Or do there always have to be good outcomes predicated on it? In which case, you could say that you're actually looking at it the wrong way around, and you could actually define the rule of law according to what leads to good outcomes or economic growth.
It's a good question, but I think that the way I would look at it is to say that I don't necessarily want the best possible outcome, but I want the predictability, and I want the consistency, and I want everyone to be equal in front of the law. If that would take me us having the second best good option, then I would probably accept that, because if what is to say that you would actually achieve the best outcome by not following the rule of law, and in whose eyes is that the best option? So I would sort of think of it as the process sifting out the best option, rather than you predetermining what the best option. That's some form of central planning in some ways, to say, I think this is the best option. But if you say that, oh, look, most human beings would want to be governed by a set of principles which would look somewhat like the following, and that being the principles of the rule of law, then the outcomes that you get out of that will generally be good. They may not be the best, but then you will have fulfilled another very important objective of society, which is to be fair. So rule of law, after all, is about being fair. So society needs to be fair, and it needs to be as efficient as possible. I tend to believe that fairness in the long term will lead to efficiency. But if it leads to the second best option of efficiency, I'm happy with that.
And how much, when you think about laws in India, how much of a part dependence does the constitution have? Because the constitution was made at one point in time, and once it is there, and therefore, change can only come through amendments in the constitution, which is really a political process and not really, often not subject to intellectual discourse. So, how much of an issue is that? Like before we started offline, you were talking about perhaps a future book of yours on alcohol laws, for example, where the last version of our directive principles happened to have that added in, whereas the previous one didn't. And as you wisely pointed out, that Gandhiji had been assassinated in between those two, so maybe that's why they put it in. You were speculating. I hope I'm not giving away things I'm not supposed to.
Not
but
at all.
yeah, but and that strikes me as one example of how a small decision in the constitution can have part dependence many years down the line. And there are good things in our constitution, but there are also bad things in our constitution. So, how do you think of that? Is it like a huge constraint you have to keep in mind, or are there ways around it?
I think it probably feels like a bigger constraint than it is, because our courts have regularly interpreted the constitution and various other laws in ways that they wanted to in order to achieve a certain outcome. And very often that outcome was fairness of some kind. So in any legal system, you can't take out the human element, the judge, out of the system. And if the judge is in some ways an embodiment of the popular morality as well on an issue at a particular point in time, the judge wasn't there when the constitution was written either. So the constitution might say something, but if it is felt that for a various set of reasons, an alternative or a slightly tweaked explanation of the constitution will lead to what is quote unquote the right outcome in the eyes of the judge will find a way to come out with a decision that will say that will either distinguish a previous decision on the facts, even though it's on the same constitutional provision, or in some cases it'll actually say the times have changed. Certain provisions of the law have been read down. Homosexuality, sexuality, for example. So things can change, and in fact they should change, because the what is the Constitution is not. I'm sort of quite against the US kind of view, which is that the Constitution was written once and you can never change it again, because the context, especially of the US Constitution, was so particular in the context of slavery, just having run away from a repressive religious regime in Europe, all sorts of things. So the expression of the morality of the time is what the US Constitution is. And that has changed over time. And so likewise for our Constitution. So it should be a living document. It should change. But we should know why we are changing it. And, it shouldn't be purely on political on a basis, as you suggested in the beginning.
Yeah, but if reflecting public morality as an individual judge may be doing, if reflecting public morality is part of, what you should aim for, then that can lead us through some very strange directions depending on the temper of the times.
No, absolutely. So it is a double-edged sword, and it doesn't mean that you reflect every version of the public morality, but and you don't sort of throw out freedom of expression because public morality is against it, but you might temper the freedom of expression in a certain way, which I might not personally agree with, but it might be a more sustainable interpretation of the Constitution today, as far as law and order, etc., is concerned. One of the biggest fights I remember having with my father was when Satanic Verses came out and it was banned. And my father, who was an absolute liberal, said yes, he was agreed with the fact that it had been banned, and I couldn't believe he'd said that, and I sort of took him up on that, and he turned around and ultimately said, "I'm an administrator. There will be blood on the streets tomorrow. So should I care about that, or should I care about the principle?" Now, I would still argue that one should care about the principle, and I know that he did as well, but you can see that practical dilemma in the eyes of the administrator, and therefore in the eyes of the judge, and it would be foolish to expect that will not color decisions as a matter of fact, rather than as a normative principle.
Yeah, I'm fully with you on upholding the principle over the blood on the streets argument, which is a very Bob Dylan-ish argument. Are you into blood on the tracks?
Yes, of course. I once, in the summer of 1987, summer holidays, I listened to Blood on the Tracks back to back for about a month.
Wow.
Morning to evening, whenever I was in the house, because I discovered it in my parents' record collection. It had never been played in front of me, and I discovered it, and to me it's just one of the best pieces of music of all time.
Masterpiece, Simple Twist of Fate, Up to Me,
every
etc.
Every
song. Yeah. I can, if we start swapping lyrics back and forth, this will never end. So, not to delay our much awaited by me incursion into talking about Trilegal, but just to stay on this subject for a moment, can you give me an example of the kind of areas in which Trustbridge therefore works? Like, what is it that is an example of a bad law that you're trying to change, and what are you trying to change it to, and what does that landscape look like?
Let me focus on the work that we're doing with regulators, because, as I said, they're a very important part of our rule-making and adjudicatory landscape. In fact, the reason why regulators are particularly interesting and important is because it's one of the few places within the life of our country where the idea of separation of powers is deliberately violated. So a regulator makes law, a regulator implements it, and a regulator adjudicates on it. So the way in which a regulator functions is very important, not just because the subject matter of what they're regulating being important for the economy, but because of the fact that the rule of law isn't being, or rather the separation of powers isn't being followed in the way that it normally would be. So the way in which we look at how regulators function has to be sort of different. And one of the questions we ask ourselves is, how do you evaluate the performance of a regulator? How do we know whether a regulator is doing well or not? And if we were to focus on the adjudicatory part, which is a very important one because it implicates the lives of many companies, we said, okay, let's look at the orders that a regulator passes. And we've looked at a few different regulators, and we're going to continue to look at more and more. But the methodology that we've developed is to say, okay, we will use a AI to study the quality or rather the regulatory orders based on the statute itself will require that a regulatory order in a certain issue contain within it certain elements to make up the offense that is being claimed. So, for instance, as far as SEBI is concerned, SEBI requires 4 elements to make up an insider trading case. Are those 4 elements there? Have they been expressed in the proper fashion? That's a question that you can train an AI to ask of the universe of all regulatory orders on insider trading. Based on that, then you look at what happens in those matters. In matters in which the regulator loses, is that being appealed? How many of those matters are being appealed? And how many of those appeals is the regulator losing? So you then get a metric of how good the quality of the order is based on how successful they ultimately are. And the appeal could go to the appellate body of the regulator or to the Supreme Court of India. So, and we've used this methodology for electricity sector regulators. We've used it for SEBI, certain kinds of SEBI orders. And we've developed a methodology which you can then use for any regulator. And we've written detailed manuals on how to do this, how to extract the key elements of an order, how to translate that into metrics, how to evaluate those metrics, etc. So that gives a very objective kind of way of saying this is working, this is not working, and you'll be able to see why it's not working. So it could be because procedure wasn't followed, it could be because there was an error of law made, or that precedent wasn't followed, etc. So that's one important area of work that we're doing. We're also looking at the power sector, inevitably, because that's an area of deep interest for me. So we're looking at, if we were to, what is the pathway to reforming the power sector? Last time we spoke when Ajay Shah was also here, we were talking about a big paper that we'd written on big principles of reform. We're looking now at how do we break some of those things down into different elements of reform, which, as we were discussing earlier, the principles that we are using is that regulation should be correcting for market failure. But in the real world, how do we implement the right thing, quote unquote, over a period of time, given the realities of the political economy? So that's another sort of part of the work that Trustbridge is doing.
I'll of course link our past episode from the show notes, as well as Everything is Everything episodes that we did on regulation, on the rule of law, all of those things. A lot of the stuff that you're doing at Trustbridge is something that will never be visible to the public. It's not, in many ways, you're playing a long game. The work you do is not measurable immediately. It'll never be attributable, perhaps. A lot of the changes will happen silently over a period of time. So what drives you to do this? Like, in the sense that, how has your sense of purpose evolved over the years, if it is something you've thought about or mapped out, or because one always makes up stories about themselves in hindsight only. Otherwise, you just muddle along getting to where you get. But, whatever sense you have of how your sense of purpose has evolved, tell me about it.
Mine has evolved quite severely. I used to be absolutely hung up on how is my great idea going to be implemented tomorrow. That was my sort of slightly arrogant, if you like, view of reform in a broad sense.
When was this your idea?
This is for most of my life. For most of my life, as soon as I started having ideas, which were slightly more meta, as you said, at a normative level, based on the experience of having done things. And it was like, look, I've done this 20 times. I've seen that this is a problem. Why cannot you see this is a problem and change the law and make it right? The world will be a better place tomorrow. So my frustration was when things were not being done correctly. I've now gone sort of quite in the other direction, which is I really don't care about the outcome of my work, quite a fundamental sense. Especially if you think of the world as it is today, there is so much that is happening that is opposed to the way that we would have thought that the world would be, and many of us are not happy with the way things are. Whether it's in our country or overseas or geopolitics, etc. So this was not the movie we thought we would be watching even 10 years ago. So you can either, beat your head on the wall and feel frustrated and say, how unlucky I was to be born at this time, where at this peak moment of my career, when I have all these great ideas and experience, no one is listening to me. You can either do that, which is of limited use and nobody cares, or you can say, look, in front of me is the opportunity to do these three pieces of work. I know something about these. I have put myself in a universe where there are other people who agree with me and are willing to work with me. I'd rather just do that piece of work that's in front of my nose and see what happens. And if something happens, great. If it didn't, it was above my pay grade. So above my pay grade is now one of my most favorite things to say, because I've realized that almost everything is above my pay grade. There are very, very few things that I have control over, from the futures of my children to the future of the nation. So it's best to just do your best in that moment with as much sincerity and effort as you can, and see what happens. And what I've actually found is that once I've taken that sort of attitude, my quality of my work and my thinking is improved. I don't feel the pressure to achieve something out of it, and I found that I'm expressing it in a way that other people seem to be going along with. And one of the great things about the Trustbridge experience so far is the number of institutions, organizations, and people who are keen to work collaboratively with us, and who appreciate the kind of work we're doing, and who actually are doing work in the field or on the ground, where they can see more clearly the pathways to interpretation than the kinds of people that we could. So we are practitioners or researchers. We are not people who have worked with government or in the not-for-profit sector. So that pathway to implementation is what is difficult for us. But luckily, we've found ourselves in an ecosystem of organizations and people that are very happy to work with us to take some of those ideas further, because we're sort of, in some ways, for some of these groups, we're providing the intellectual fodder that they can then see the pathway to implementation based on their interactions with government. And to be fair, there are lots of people, central government, state governments, who want to make things better. I think that we haven't built up the intellectual capital within the state to a sufficient degree, but a lot of good people recognize that there are people outside government who, with the best of intentions, want to support these efforts. And you find the opportunities to do them. I'm also at the age where a lot of my pals from college, etc., are reasonably senior in government. So if I go to them and say, hey, look, here's an idea. What do you think? Can you speak to someone, introduce me to someone who will be interested in it and want to do something about it? Usually the answers are positive. And we're doing a couple of things with government directly as a consequence of that. So that's my long-winded answer to that sense of purpose. So my sense of purpose now is limited to what's the piece of work in front of me, and how well is it being done.
I love the way you use the phrase "above my pay grade" giving it a sort of dimension. I haven't thought of it before, as to represent the uncontrollables. This is above my pay grade. So in a sense, in a nutshell, what you're doing is you're showing agency towards what you can control, and a kind of Buddhist acceptance towards what you can't control.
Buddhist or even Gita or whatever, it's but which actually, if you think about it, to not do that is a form of madness. To not be able to see, especially when the examples are being thrown in your face over and over again, to not see that you can't control it, and then to be angry because you can't, or to be frustrated, upset, sad, depressed, whatever, is really a form of madness. So the way out of it is just to say, what can I do? And maybe what I can do today, I can only conceive of it in a very small, localized sense. But maybe bigger things will happen over time. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. It also helps, Amit, not to be overly invested in the future of the human race in general. So I'm ambivalent to the future of the human race.
So I'm going to sort of dig a little deep into that question of what you can control, because what you can't control, right? If you're smart enough and if you're reflective enough, you know what you can't control. But I feel that, and I'm probably revealing my own flaws of character when I say that sometimes you overestimate what you can control. Like, it would be natural for someone like me to say that I can control what I do. I can sit and write for 4 hours a day if I want to, and I can tell myself that. But actually, how much can I control even that? Maybe innately I don't have the capacity to do that, which would be a terrible cop out, and I'm not saying that. But we don't know ourselves as well as we think, and we don't control ourselves as much as we think. We were discussing before this how neither of us believe in free will, but we live as if we do. So even when you think of the controllables, it can get frustrating because you don't actually control all the things you think you control. But obviously, in the context of Trustbridge or whatever, that's not the case. You know exactly what you can control and what you can't.
Well, you don't necessarily know exactly, but if you start from the from the perspective that you can hardly control anything, then you just surprise yourself when there are things, when people do start listening to you and you find that there is some element of control. So I find that that's the way that you set your expectations low and exceed them rather than the other way around. But I think for me, I've learned a lot in relation to what I'm capable of through sport, through endurance sport. Because I've been a runner and a cyclist for a very long time, and you can set yourself goals and gradually work towards them if you really want to achieve them over a period of time. It may not happen at the first step or the fifth or the 10th, but it these sorts of things do tend to play out. The long game does work. So that I've learned a lot from.
Is there something in particular which didn't work out when you started with it, but eventually it did because you just stuck with it bullheadedly?
In running?
In any domain, right?
Well, in running, certainly. When I thought that when I ran my first marathon, I thought I was quick enough to break 3 hours. It took me 11 marathons to do it. And I came close a number of times, but I knew at some point I figured out that physiologically I was capable of doing it. I needed to train hard and get it right on the day, which any long distance runner will tell you. All sorts of things can go wrong in the day up to or the day of a race. So you realize that if you realize you get a certain sense at some point that you are capable of doing the thing that you have set out to do. And then it's a question of having the patience and the persistence to do it. I do not for a second claim that I can do that for many domains of my life, but in one or two, being able to do it in one or two tells you that you should be able to do it in more. Then it's up to you to decide to do it. And I don't put any pressure on myself to say, oh, I have to try and achieve this one objective, even if I'm not fussed about not achieving it. So I have no specific objective in mind as far as Trustbridge is concerned, because also I'm not the only person there. I'm not even the only founder. Different people want to achieve different things out of it, and you have to let the river flow in the way that it does.
Let the river flow, indeed. Before this, while over lunch, and appropriately over lunch, we were talking about your cooking life. And you mentioned how, one of the things you're most proud of is your Mughlai short ribs, and perhaps more on that in a future episode. Gentle readers, I've been trying to convince Akshay to actually write a book on cooking, because for half an hour he spoke about it and I was just enthralled. But the key takeaway from that is that you are both a man of system and a creative man, in the sense that you come up with a broad set of algorithms for cooking, and then within a particular algorithm, you are as creative as possible. You can do whatever, but the algorithm guides you. So my larger question, therefore, is there, now that you have some notion of what your purpose is and the equanimity you need towards things you can't control, is there a broader algorithm for life that you've set for yourself, and then whatever you do falls within it in different ways?
Not really. No, I don't. I haven't thought deeply enough about life, and I'm approaching 60. In a couple of years I'll be 60, and so maybe 20-25 years of an intellectual life left, but I want to read and write as much as I can. That is an objective. I actually want to try and read faster, and I might take some tips from you later on how to do that, because I know that you read very quickly. I want to read and write more. Because I think that it's the reading and the writing, and I include listening to clever intellectual podcasts as reading. I absorb much better by listening than I do by reading anyway. As sort of being fodder for ideas, which gives you ideas on which you can use on to add to the experience that you already have. So it's just more of the same, and without again being too fussed about where it all lands up. I do want to keep as fit as I can. That is very much an objective, and I just know that my life works better both physically and mentally, and there's like tons of science now to prove that the single most important thing you can do for your mental health as much as for your physical health is keeping fit. And for me, keeping fit is not just keeping fit, but doing sport, doing something which is semi-competitive, at least with yourself. Because then that gives me the ability to follow a training program for a while, which is either coming up to a race, or coming up to a cycling tour or something where you want to be the best version of yourself. So that's something that I find is it's challenging, it's fun, it's enjoyable. You get good moments. You get these nice moments with yourself when you do that sort of thing.
As far as the question on reading faster is concerned, my short answer to that would be don't try. Because, people often ask me this because I do read fast, but I can read at the speed I read because I've been reading since I was a little kid. And what I kind of tell people, and I have an episode on reading and on Everything is Everything, which I'll link from the show notes. But what I keep telling people is, it doesn't matter how many books you read in a year. It's not an Olympics. What is important is how much time you spend reading in a day. It's a time which is important, whether you're reading 3 pages or 20 pages. And the reason that time is important is that because your mind is then in that relaxed state of focused reading where you're immersing yourself into something, and that state of mind is important. What you're actually taking into me isn't important. That state of mind, if you can be in that state of mind without looking at your phone, you're reading a book for a couple of hours, mind-blowing. It doesn't matter how many pages you've read.
So I do that most days. I wake up not desperately early, but reasonably early before anyone else is up. And I leave my phone in the room and I go and sit in the living room with a book. And I read for anywhere between, depending on the day, 30 minutes to 2 hours.
Wow.
Most days. And the interesting thing is, because I wear a heart rate monitor at all times, my lowest heart rate of the day, including counting when I'm asleep, is when I'm reading.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because it's when I'm probably most unfocused or focused, or whichever way you want to look at it, when I'm not thinking about anything else, but it's sort of flow state.
The eddies of the world have slowed down, and you're just in that.
It is flow state, and flow state is something I've experienced occasionally through running, and it's something that you also experience through reading. You read 5-10 pages of a book and you don't know where that time went, and it's that feeling of having eaten a delicious meal. So I hear what you're saying, but I still would like to be able to read more, and one of the things I think maybe I'll start doing is mixing up my reading a bit, and maybe going back to reading 2 books at a time, which is read non-fiction in the morning and read fiction in the evening, because non-fiction is informing work and in a more instrumental way, whereas the fiction is sort of just adding to the quality of your life, and it's more maza. So you can do the maza even in the evening, where where there's other stuff happening. If you're reading an absorbing story, then you can take distractions around you.
I actually have 3-4 books open at the same time on my Kindle, and this year my resolution has been to read more fiction, which I've kind of been doing. So like 70% of my open books are generally fiction, and they give me a lot of joy. Let's talk about writing. When we had last met, I think either then or in a subsequent conversation we would have had over WhatsApp, you mentioned that you were using this site called Nicheless, and every day you were doing a little bit of writing, and that was really helping. And eventually, as you pointed out, that culminated in building the muscle that led to the book happening. So tell me a bit more about that phase. That, why did you think it was important for you to go for an exercise like that where you're writing every day? And then what was that process like and what did it lead to?
I think one, everybody, including you, who's built a writing habit or a reading habit, say you have to just get down and do it, and build that muscle. Uh, so it was that principle, and maybe I was also following, running training kind of learning, which is that you just have to get down and do it every day, and when you do it every day, then good things happen, and you become better at it. So over that 30-day period, when I wrote one 300-word blog every day, I found that it became easier to write. In the beginning, I was sort of writing and rewriting and being dissatisfied, and it became better. I wasn't, you're never going to be completely satisfied, because I also had 24 hours within which to do it, and I had other things to do in those 24 hours. And I was doing silly things like going out for dinner, coming back at 11:30 at night, and sitting down and writing the 300 words, because I hadn't time to do it. My wife said, you're again, doing mad things like you tend to do. But then once you do it, you get this sense of satisfaction. I saw that what I was writing was, at least in my own eyes, getting slightly better. So it was that knowledge that if you, it's like cooking. I mean, you can follow a recipe. I'm very suspicious of people who say, I make the best meat in the world. I do it once or twice a year, but it's really, really good. And it may be, but that was not the kind of cook I am. I'm the sort of cook who needs to do the same thing many times. Then it becomes easy, and then you can do, whip out something good most days. So it's the same kind of approach. I'd just seen that happen in other areas of my life, and I was probably instinctively trying to follow something similar.
And when did the thought of the book occur to you? When did you decide you want to write a book, and when did you decide you want to write this book?
Well, amongst those 30 pieces, there were 2 or 3 pieces which were little anecdotal stories about the early days of the firm. And unlike the other things I'd written, which I did not put on LinkedIn, these I put on LinkedIn because they related to my professional life in some way. And I think it's important for people who are a little more senior in the profession every now and then to show a human side of themselves, because otherwise, there are a lot of people who get this impression. There's this term big law. It really relates to the big law firms of the West, but it's been applied in a local context as well. Big law firms are like this, and all the people there are like that. There's this toxic culture everywhere. There are these tropes that come out, and there are elements of those things which are true. But if you humanize, how do you humanize things? And one small way of humanizing it is to say, okay, look, we started from nothing. We were just some chaps in a room doing work and going to have head massages whenever we were free, which was relatively often. And though that's who we were, and we may have built a big firm out of that, but that person in some ways never changes. You don't decide one day that now I'm going to be a bada saab and I'm not going to be that chap. And I still thoroughly enjoy my head massages. So I put it on LinkedIn, and lots of people responded very well, because I could see the number of reads, because people clicked through to the site, which gave me a counter of number of people. Around 6,000 people were reading those small pieces. And a few people said, oh, hey, we need some more of these. And a few more people said, look, why don't you write a book? And then Ajay Shah said, look, stop all of this, shut it down, don't write any more pieces, write a proper book on building an institution. So that's how the idea came. As far as timing, I procrastinated to start off with. It was hard. It was hard work to get going, because I'd never done something like this before. But I thought last year in 2025, we turned 25. And I thought it'd be a good thing to do it within that year. It was a good moment to put out something. And also because, there's a lot of cynicism in relation to law firms, as I was saying earlier, that they are sweatshops, etc. There's a lot of cynicism in relation to the corporate world. I thought that our story is a relatively positive story, where people who didn't come from backgrounds in the law achieved something which I thought was valuable, and in a way that people hadn't done before. So I thought it would be a good idea to put out a positive story of institution building in 21st century India.
No, and I love the anecdotes that come in through your book. Like you mentioned the head massage, and that was an amusing part where after you shift office from Nizamuddin to Panchsheel Enclave, you still have your head Masood Dharampal come band akal ke tale kholne ke liye, as it were, until another of your partner Shumanto tells you that, hey, chill out, this is not done, and you had to kind
But
of stop
I'm
that.
the wheel comes full circle. Now at Trilegal, we have a whole wellness program.
Oh,
So which is excellent. I think there's a very, very serious and important part of it. Most of it is serious and important, which is mental health and taking care of the needs of young professionals working very hard, often away from their families in cities where they don't know people. There's a support structure that is required, and we try and do a little bit there. But part of this program includes a chair massage where some people come in and give you a malish, which makes me feel very upset, which is when we were doing it organically, we were prevented from doing it. And I have been diddled out of 20 years of massages at work as a consequence. So I don't know who I can take it up with. But anyway, that's
never
where
too
we are.
late. You should totally sue. I mean, this is not America, but you could have sued.
I can't sue my own firm. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so, do you get head massages at Trustbridge when you're in Delhi?
No, I don't go that often to the Trustbridge office. We do lots of things remotely, but no. I have now. I'm a big boy. I'm an adult. I can have my head massages whenever I choose.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm just imagining that even if you're working remotely, say you're sitting in Paris and Dharampal is in Delhi, assuming he's still.
Dharampal retired and went back to Himachal, I think, many years ago.
It's very sad, but even from Himachal, you should build something where you're sitting in Paris and you have sensors on your head, and he's got some device, some dummy with similar sensors on the head of the dummy, and he can give you a massage from Himachal. And wouldn't that be nice? Maybe you're.
Yes, but there are one or two other masseurs in the world, so I.
नहीं, लेकिन धर्मपाल जी के हाथ का जो जादू था, I'm imagining that's
जादू बिल्कुल था.
Yeah. So, what was the process of writing the book like? Because one thing I realized while reading the book is that the prose is clear and easy to read, and so on, and also it's beautifully structured. Everything makes sense. The sections, the chapters, everything makes sense. And I'm just thinking that, how much of this is down to, say, the lawyerly training, where you think in a structured way, and exactly like even a chapter you have about the style guide that you made, and when I was reading that, I thought, yeah, this is perfect. If only every writer could also internalize something like this, a lot of the muddle in your head would go away if you could just master structure. So tell me about that. Like, how much did your lawyerly training play into structuring the book? Did you structure it all beforehand and know the narrative beforehand, or did you figure out some of it as you went along? Like, in a sense, did you have an algo for the book and then you played around within it? How was that?
No, I used this software called Scrivener, which I think is excellent. It works for someone like me. It's not very complicated, but it gives you tabs on the left-hand side of the page, which is a click into each different chapter, and it's very clean and easy to use. It really worked for me. What I did initially is that I chucked some of those 300-word blogs into different buckets. I also said, okay, am I going to do a bunch of anecdotes around which I'll wrap a story? Am I going to do this chronologically, or am I going to do it thematically? My initial preference was to do it thematically, which would have meant that, I would have said something about partnership, about decision making, about the different themes about HR, the different themes of life in a law firm. I just found that there was too much that was interdependent. So when we were changing something with the partnership structure, we were also doing something on governance, and the two were very much linked. So despite my initial instincts not to do it chronologically, I said I'll do it chronologically till 2020. So till 2020, it goes pretty much as a running story. But from 2020 to 2025, we had such dramatic growth that it's also very recent. So it didn't make sense being chronological for that 5-year period, and to say, okay, here's a time where we can look back and say, okay, what did all of this amount to? We've used a model that other people haven't used before. We've used a governance system that is relatively rare. What has that achieved? Because if we'd just been a medium-sized law firm with, some success and a little bit of recognition, that would have been one story. but to have become possibly the largest firm in the country by 2025 using this model is a different story. So then you switch to saying, okay, now we can become thematic, and now we can say, okay, what were the broader themes that were running through this period that led to this explosive growth in 2020? And that was how the structure sort of it emerged in that fashion, because it seemed like the only logical way to tell the story. But I did try and play around with a couple of different models, and then move chapters around, and Scrivener allows you to do that really easily. So that was one set of methods. The other thing that I did, because I've never been much of a reader of organizational theory or startup stories or that sort of thing, you occasionally pick up the odd quote here and there, so you know who the thinkers in the field are. But here's where AI helped. So I'd write a chapter and I put it into AI, and I'd say, put it into Perplexity ideally, and say, who are the people who've written about the themes that I've covered in this chapter, and who've commented on these kinds of ways in which startups do decision making or resolve conflict, etc. And it says, here are a bunch of articles or books. So then you go and read those, and then you learn then you can apply a theory to your own experience, and suddenly you say, oh, actually that's what was going on. So it was a huge process of learning for me, possibly the most consolidated learning I've done since law school, possibly, where in a year's time you're learning so much about your own experience, both because you're rehashing that experience, you're going through that experience again, but also because you're applying these more conceptual, analytical lenses that other people have developed to yourself. Because when you're sitting and doing the work on a day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year basis, you aren't sort of contemplating your navel at the same time. You aren't saying, okay, what is it that I'm doing right now? Let me analyze that. Maybe today people do it because we're such a performative society, or the world has become performative, especially with social media. But we were certainly not doing it at that point. So it gave me the opportunity to say, okay, when we took decisions in this fashion, or we decided that we would have this structure, it was an expression of these sets of principles, or at least that's a way in which you can look at it. So that's another thing that I did in a bunch of for a bunch of chapters, which lent themselves to that. Other than some reading on my own. So I'm a great fan of Rick Rubin's. And many of the things he said while I was reading his book, many of the things that he said, I applied them to our book. And so I've got a couple of quotes from him. He was, while reading his book, I was thinking about my book throughout, because even though his book is about creation and about innovation, there was a lot that applied to, the way that we were creating the firm.
Yeah, especially love the quote you picked from his book. Rules direct us to average behaviors. If you're aiming for greatness, rules won't help. So, in his book, Testaments Betrayed, Milan Kundera came up with a metaphor which I absolutely love. It's about a man in a fog. And he says that imagine that there's a man in a fog, and all around him there is fog. He doesn't know what he's going to do, where he's got to go, etc., etc. And he starts walking in one direction. And the road he's walking down is the road that he takes. And then he keeps walking. And at the end of the journey, if you turn around and you look at the journey taken, you will see the man and you will see the road, but you will not see the fog. And another good reason why we should be wary of passing judgment on people in history, because we never see the fog. We just see the things that they did, and and we were earlier talking about free will, and and how that's made you less judgmental, realizing that there is no free will. But this is another reason to not be judgmental. We don't see the fog. Now in this journey,
also, Amit, we don't see our own fog.
Exactly,
it's very hard to. There are phases in the last 25 years, which I have relatively dim memories of. I have very sharp memories of the early days, but say from 2010 to 2015, when it became a little more routine, a little more metronomic, if you like it, for a certain period of time, I have fewer memories of that. The sharp, difficult moments or the great successful moments, they stand out. But when you're consolidating and you're doing the difficult day-to-day work of just showing up and doing the work, going out and trying to get the work, that's quite hard to. In fact, I often I feel slightly resentful of the heroic way in people who achieve enormous weight loss are treated. That, look, this person has lost 50 kilos and now they've run a marathon. What about the person who never put on the weight in the first place, was disciplined throughout, and has done similar things? That's not dramatic. So that's similar to, in the middle years when you're just quietly building. So that I have sort of dim memories of. But I had lots of emails to go back and look at, and there were a lot of aha moments. Wow, yes, I remember that kind of thing. While going back and looking at those emails and speaking to many of my partners, because I did over 100 interviews for this book.
No, I was about to say that what I was arriving at is that what I really enjoyed about the book is that you do see some of the fog. It would have been very easy for you to do grandstanding and give business gyan and say, this is, this is what our journey illustrates. These are the grand principles. But you haven't actually done that. You've taken us through a chronology of all the mistakes that you made. Like you said, you feel a fog around you between 2010 and 2015. But actually that 2012 crisis that happened at Trilegal, which we'll speak about later in the episode, you capture the fog there. You, in fact, I think, allude to your own bad behavior there at one point in time.
We actually had but the thing is, I had forgotten all of that. So I had to go back and remember. Because so that period in 2012 was a different type of crisis. It was we weren't experiencing the crisis day to day, but when we did the survey with the partners that we can talk about in a bit, then we realized that there was a problem. So it's not a sort of consistent manner in which you can look back at the past. There are peaks and troughs in your memory, and those are dependent on a number of factors, not just the salience of what happened, but how otherwise occupied you were, what else was going on in your life. I mean, if I think of 2010 to 2015 for me, I had 4 little daughters. My younger ones came in 2008. The elder ones had come in 2005. I had 4 small children who occupied a lot of headspace. So all I was doing then was working and looking after children and running. I had no social life, nothing. So you will remember only certain types of things out of that.
And I'm just thinking that, before you start writing the book, you have a certain conception of what your life was like and what those years were like. Then you have to dig deep into all the emails and etc. And your memories are being fleshed out in different ways. It is almost like a reconstruction of the self based on, the new memories that you're sort of discovering all over again. What was that process like? And I'm equally sure, for example, that if you were to speak to each of your daughters about what you were like between 2020 and 2015, there would be an entirely different Akshay which emerges in that, and you'd again have to restructure yourself. But leaving that aside, what was it like kind of going back and examining yourself, and how did it feel? Because you would have seen things about yourself which you would have admired, but you would have also seen things which would have made you cringe a bit.
So exactly. So there were some cringe, absolute physical cringe moments, and there were some moments that said, hey, that was actually pretty cool. Both of those, and I'd forgotten many of both of those types of things. Cringe, understandably, but even the small interesting moments sort of came back to life while having conversations with people, because different people remember different things. But then you have the luxury of adding other people's memories through the process of writing this book, of adding other people's memories back to your own, and no doubt rewriting some of your own memories in the process, but doesn't matter.
This is also something I find unusual that you did in the writing of your book, that typically you'll perhaps go through your own memories and you'll look at all whatever the written records indicate and etc. But what you did was that you systematically spoke to a whole bunch of people about their memories and actually quoted them at different points in the book about what they remembered and so on. What made you decide upon that methodology to put the material together?
That was a very simple answer to that question, which is, this is not a book about me. This is a book about the firm. And I was very clear about the fact that there wouldn't be one word in this that would go in if any of the founders were opposed to it. So they all read the book and they were clear that they were okay. They said, "Look, we might say things differently, but we are okay for you to say it like this." But in certain circumstances where perhaps either the memory was slightly different or the experience of an event was different, it was important to capture that because that's as much part of the life of the firm as my memory. And inevitably you will not capture all perspectives. As the firm grows larger, there are 150 partners now, you will not be able to capture everyone's perspective. But the idea was that you capture sufficient perspectives so that most people, my first constituency for this book were the founders. The next constituency is my partners, all my partners. So my intention was that everyone should be able to see a little bit of themselves in this book. So for that, I couldn't presume to do that by only putting my own views in. And I realized actually that some of my perceptions of certain kinds of events or my views of the time were actually incorrect, were actually not as well formed as they could have been, because I was seeing things from my perspective and other people saw it from other perspectives. So the idea was to try and get a richer, more rounded viewpoint of the life of the firm rather than just my life in the firm.
Yeah, and I think that really worked as well. Let's, I want to now pretty much follow the structure of the book itself for the rest of our conversation, because the structure just works so well. And you begin the book by explaining what is corporate law, but also at the same time talking about the history of law firms in India. And, this is one of the realizations I've had about the world, that when you grow up, things are a particular way and you imagine they have always been this way. But actually, one of the things I've learned is everything is recent, and law firms, in fact, began in India, as you point out, in 1830 is the first one. The next one is 1850s. The first ones with Indian partners start happening in the last quarter of the 19th century, and so on and so forth. So tell me a little bit about how the practice of law actually comes about in India and how those early law firms happen, back in the day,
Well, I have a very sort of academic and superficial understanding of that, largely
because you weren't alive then.
Largely because I wasn't alive, but also because there's been very, very little research. There are some of the old firms do have records, but I'm told that they haven't been made accessible to the public. I think there is, if not a book of a PhD thesis in the history of law firms and looking at how they've developed. I think maybe more than one. So law firms in India began as a sort of appendage to the colonial economy, which was some amount of commercial contracts, some conveyancing, which is transfer of immovable property, and some mercantile stuff. So you'll find that Bombay was the center, because that was where lots of trade was going on. There was shipping law, there was that sort of thing. And as the presidency towns grew, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, so the court systems grew around those. And the law firms grew in order to service the requirements of the colonial economy in those days. And they were a lot of them were set up by Parsis especially in Bombay. And over a period of time, they grew to service the various economic requirements of the time. And as you said, by the end of the 19th century, you started having Indians set up law firms. Khaitan and Company, for instance, was set up as a joint venture. Fox and Mandal was set up as a joint venture in Calcutta, and Khaitan and Company came up, etc. And then Shroff came later, just around the time of the First World War. So we don't really know a lot about what they were doing. We don't even really know a lot about what law firms were doing after independence during the socialist period. We do know that there was a lot of work around nationalization of banks, insurance companies, all of that. There was a lot of work around that. There were some commercial transactions taking place, but because the economy was so closed and so small and so focused on the public sector, where public sector deals happened, with other public sector companies on the basis of a letter or an office note or a minister's order, and there weren't a lot of private to private transactions going on from what we can tell, but there was some, and some of the larger law firms as they exist today were involved with them. So the period from 1830 to 1991 is somewhat murky for the public. I think within each law firm that existed in that period, there are probably records, and I really would encourage them to share those records. Khaitan and Co. actually wrote a book for their 100 years, which talks about they have a storied history with the founder of the firm being involved in the writing of the constitution and things of that kind. But there wasn't much to say about how law firms were structured. And I think that what Khaitan did, if other firms also do, at least make their archives available to researchers, I think that'll be it'll be a service to anyone who's a chronicler of modern Indian history.
So, a couple of questions, perhaps centered around 91, or what the landscape was around 30 years ago. And one is, tell me about the structure of each law firm. In the sense, you've pointed out that most of them were family firms. Even if they were partnerships, they weren't actually partnerships. You didn't have equity, you just had salary. What was the structure of law firms in those days, and how had that structure evolved up till that point in time? And I'll save my next question for after this.
No, I think that you're right. They were all largely family firms. They were occasionally in some of those firms very eminent lawyers who are not family members, who might sort of have come to the top, but they would never really be that involved in decision making, or at least they wouldn't have a casting vote. The family would always have that. And in some cases, we begin to see some of those senior lawyers with good practices, good reputations, breaking off and setting up their own firms, even in the early 90s. That process had started. So, for example, Ranji Dua broke off from Dada Chanji and Company, which itself had broken off from another firm. And that's how these things happened. Law firms were in some ways replicating what happened with senior advocates. Senior advocates would have juniors within their chambers. The juniors would work with them for a few years, acquire experience. A few clients would be comfortable with working with them. They would obviously be cheaper than their bosses. So the clients would say, hey, why don't you set up on your own? We'll give you some work. I suspect that something similar was happening, either because clients were encouraging it or because lawyers got confident and said, hey, I think I can do this on my own. So that's definitely what was going on. And to some extent, it's what happened with us as well. We had slightly different motivations, but that I think was there were various new law firms that were coming up in the 90s in the wake of liberalization, but they were all sort of following a similar kind of pattern, which is, and I mentioned this in the book, which is the idea of being your own boss, because the glass ceiling is so low that when you stand up from your chair, you hit it.
Well said. Tell me now about the ecosystem. Like, what did these law firms do? Like, as you pointed out, in the socialist era before 91, there wasn't much corporate law happening. The landscape was very different. So, what did they do, and how did that begin to change after 1991? You've got a great chapter on what is corporate law, where you hit back against a common Indian notion, perhaps taken from your favorite art form, Bollywood. And I'm being sarcastic there, gentle reader. Where people imagine that law is all about, you're going to the court and you're wearing a black robe and it's tariq pe tariq and you're arguing all the time and etc. etc. But actually the corporate law world is incredibly different and whatever. So, but tell me about what these law firms did and how that evolved into modern corporate law and how that started in the 90s.
Well, a lot of these law firms did some amount of corporate work, but a lot of them did litigation as well. So they would prepare briefs for senior counsel to argue. They would also, because senior counsel can't sort of engage clients directly, there has to be someone in between, either an individual lawyer or a firm, and they would be doing that work. But very quickly, as liberalizations opened up various kinds of opportunities, whether it was interpreting new law, or whether it was seeking government approvals to do things that were being opened up which were still subject to approvals, whether it was structuring joint ventures, whether it was doing acquisitions of companies, being involved in setting up infrastructure projects. All of these things either required a new kind of legal advice or legal advice on new issues, or it required more detailed and more sophisticated contracts that then had sort of been part of the life of law firms and lawyers in India before that. So that was the kind of work. And I remember, the first power purchase agreement I looked at was 150 pages long. So these were very detailed, sophisticated contracts which were being imported from other parts of the world where they'd been used in similar jurisdictions which were common law based, the US, the UK, etc. And foreign law firms were very prominent. They were working with Indian law firms as local counsel most often. Foreign law firms would do the lion's share of the work very often, or at the very least, they would check almost all the work that Indian law firms did. And I sort of point out there were 3 or 4 different algorithms in which these firms worked with Indian firms at the time. And that was what the early to mid 90s, even towards the late 90s, that's what it looked like. So it was a period of transformation, people doing new work. But look, Indian lawyers have always been quite clever. So the ability to adapt to what was going on intellectually was very much there. And people were learning sort of every day on the job. I remember at Dua Associates, we'd crowd over the fax machine in the morning to see what new questions have come in from clients and international firms, because we were, everyone was keen to dig in and do this new work, and it was exciting.
I'll take a digression and ask one more general question, but it's sparked by something that is in your chapter about the partners, where when you're writing about Sridhar Gorthi, you point out about how because there was no internet in that time, a core skill that you had to pick up, and he did, is you have to pour through dozens of physical case law books and, just grasp all that territory. And I'm wondering how different it is for a lawyer trained in the analog era to the digital era, and whether that just makes a difference in the way that you think. Like, I will now take an even further and perhaps unwarranted digression even for you, and talk about chess, where, if you look at the great young Indian chess players that they have, it is often said of Gukesh that he is kind of unique in 2 interesting ways, right? And one is that his brute force calculation power is mind-blowing. That, you give him a position, you give him enough time, and this is why he's good at classical and gets into trouble in the shorter variants. You give him enough time, he can calculate so far that even like Magnus Carlsen once after a game remarked that when he was chatting about it with Gukesh, he was surprised that, oh my God, he calculated that, like what the hell is going on? But his weakness, and the reason why he is not so good in shorter time formats, is again something that Carlsen pointed out, is that his intuition is not that great, that he can't just look at a position and intuitively have a sense of what is the right thing to do here. He must do brute force calculation, right? And one should not, of course, caricature this. It simply means, obviously he has some intuition, and obviously, but the reason this would have come about is that where Gukesh is different from all his Indian peers, Arjun and Pragnanda and all that, is that the entire young generation really grew up with computers, always using an engine while training. While one of Gukesh's early coaches made this plan and got the assent of Gukesh's parents that in those early years, for 2 or 3 years, Gukesh would not be allowed to use a computer. He would have to sit with a physical chessboard in front of him, or whatever, the chessboard in his head, and he would have to do everything himself. And I'm speculating that A, this is why his calculation skills were so great, because he had to. He didn't have the computer to help him. And B, this is also why his intuition is not as highly developed as his peers, because he's not putting in the volume in terms of playing thousands of games with a computer or against other players online, and therefore the intuition hasn't had the chance to develop. So having got the chess part of it over with, I wonder if, for lawyers that had Sridhar, or yourself for that matter, or any of you who were part of that last pre-internet generation, if you were to come up as young lawyers today, would you think differently? Because today there are both pros and cons to having everything online. One is you find shortcuts through a lot of the work, and AI can just do so much work for you in terms of digging up stuff that you need to dig up, and that's great. That's fantastic. Your breadth is greater. You can I'm guessing research more in terms of volume. But I would imagine at some level the depth is less, and there's a danger you might miss nuances, and there is a benefit to your brain actually having to do all that work and read every line, parse all of that, and make sense of it. And that is perhaps lost. And you have both, grown up in that era and at the same time transitioned to the other era where no doubt your own research methods have changed. And equally, you can see young lawyers today in Trilegal and the way they come through the system. So what is your sense of this?
There's no doubt that I think there will be a change in the way that people's brains work. I think that, I was listening to this Oxford professor or Cambridge professor was talking about how AI is not coming up with anything new. It's just very, very good at pattern recognition. So if you give it a new problem, a novel problem that has never come up, it's not going to be able to solve it very easily. Whereas a human being might be able to do it because you'll solve it by analogy to various things which might seem unconnected, but you can draw some inferences from it. So I think it's a bit like that. We are in some ways small language models within ourselves. We have done things in the analog fashion for a long time. So there's a pattern recognition that we have, and we've been fed enough information that we can now make those inferences. We've got enough experience that you can make inferences for new situations. And I find that myself, when I'm asked a question, I find myself doing that. I find myself linking different bits of my experience to the question at hand. Whereas a younger lawyer is probably going to go and do the research and see what everything other than their brain is telling them about that. However, there are, I in some ways, have skipped a few generations of research methods. I never used any of the online SCC online or these sorts of Manupatra. I've never used them myself. By the time that those became established, I could tell people to go and do the research. So people did that. But now I do a lot of research on my own using AI because I feel that I can ask questions of a certain type because I've actually got the knowledge or experience to ask good questions, to be able to get research outputs that then I can use in the work that I'm doing. So I actually feel slightly worried that there will be potentially a gap in innovative thinking. That we might come across. That I've not necessarily experienced that myself, but just on first principles, on the basis of this discussion we've just been having, I think it's possible that we may lose some of the ability, like Gukesh, to think in a certain fashion, or rather actually like the other fellows who've been using computing to think in a certain fashion. I don't know. I'm not an expert on AI, and I've not sort of thought hard about it. But my instinct is that people with actual lived experience of having done a variety of different types of transactions or deals, or just numbers of them, will be able to come up with, for the moment, better and more innovative solutions than AI would. AI would certainly help you to power that thinking, but I don't know if it will come up with something completely new.
Swapna Little has a great book called The Broken Script, which is based about, which is a history of Delhi in a 50-year period from approximately 1803 to 1857. And one of the startling things about that period that really changes is that when that period starts, Persian is the official language, the link language of all of India. And by the end of it, it's English and Persian is gone. So there's a generation of people who grow up learning Persian because they think, oh, that's the link language and I'm going to be the main bureaucrat and I'm going to rule everything, and suddenly they are completely redundant and they've just gotten unlucky. And I feel, thinking aloud, and I hope Gukesh fans won't be mad at me for saying this, but he's learning the old ways, kind of like learning Persian, because I think classical chess is soon going to become less and less relevant, and he's really then got to, all the action will be in the shorter forms as well as in chess 960, and I'm not sure how well he'll do there. Early evidence suggests not well at all, but that's an entirely different matter. Let's Let's talk now about the people who founded Trilegal. And what interests me is that early on you make a comment about the extraordinary confluence of good luck, that not only did the six of you come together, but you could actually work together. You had similar values and everything fell into place. And I would argue that the very fact that you were in the place where you were contemplating something like this, leads to a sort of selection effect. Like, the course that I teach life lessons, we had an offline meetup in Goa in October of that. And I remember I was the first person in there. And while I was waiting for people to gradually come from the airport and get to the resort, and some 50 people showed up for that, the first 11 people or something who showed up were all on a sabbatical. And it might seem like a mad coincidence, but I'm like, this is a selection effect. This is exactly the kind of person who's going to pay a premium to do a course like this, because they're full of curiosity, they value knowledge, they want to do new things, they're not accepting life as there is, they're not part of the groove, etc., etc. So now looking back, would you agree that there was a kind of selection effect, that it was quite likely that the six people who came together with the intention that, yeah, let's get out of the groove and start a firm, would in any case be like that? Or would you say that no, there could have been many people like that, and it was actually genuine good luck that it was just these six?
No, I think it's a bit of both. I think the good luck was that we knew there were these connections, one to the other, 1 degree, 2 degrees of separation, that we could come together. But there was definitely some amount of self-selection. It wasn't as if there were 20 people out of which these are the 6 people who ended up being the Trilegal founders. These were the people who one or another person thought, okay, let's add this one other person, because they'd got a sense of what the group was going to be like, and they felt that this X person is going to be a more appropriate part of it than somebody else. And in fact, even to the exclusion of saying, oh, yeah, that guy is a closer friend of mine, but I think the other fellow is going to be a better partner, a better founder for the firm. So I think there was to that extent a decent amount of maturity, probably more from the other guys than from me, because I'm the sort of fellow who would just say, look, this all sounds good to me, let's go and do it, and let's see what the consequences are. I'm perhaps a little more risk taking, not because I have a risk taking approach, but because I think I have a trusting approach. So generally that works for me. So I'm it's something that I stick to. When I get a good feeling with a person, then I don't necessarily get into an enormous calculus about what are the specific skills or benefits they're bringing to the table. Sounds good, feels good, do it, is my general approach. So I think it's a bit of both. Self-selection definitely happened, and it wasn't as if we're all, in personality terms, we are quite different from each other. In values and background, superficially we look very similar, but human beings are human beings, and in that sense we are quite different.
So, how much of a factor is it that none of you came from a law family? Nobody had a parent in the law, so it wasn't as if, all of you in a sense were outsiders. And at the same time, what were you getting away from? What was a push factor? Why were you dissatisfied with the existing options that were there?
It was this very simple thing of the fact that we could not see a world in which the existing firms would not continue to be controlled by the founders or the families that ran them. And that was not the kind of environment that we felt that we were suited for a variety of different specific reasons. But in general, it was this thing of, look, I'm not going to be able to make my own decisions. I feel I've got some ability. And even when nobody thought we would reach where we have reached now, but we thought we could be reasonably successful on the back of our own ability. And we felt that we didn't need another brand. We didn't need someone else's platform to do this from. And remember that no firm at that time was very big. The largest firm might have had 150 lawyers at best. And even that might be an exaggeration. I write 150 in the book, but it might be less than that. So the market was young enough. The corporate legal profession was young enough. So there weren't any seasoned veterans of doing thousands of transactions. We arrived only 7 or 8 years, or rather our careers started only 3 or 4 years after liberalization. So we were learning on the job as much as our bosses were learning on the job in some ways. They just had a few more years of experience. So it was really a moment in time where that seemed feasible, and we did not see, and it's something I mentioned in the book, and this is the Tocqueville effect, which is that there were little attempts at reform that were going on in these traditional firms. Let's make some partners. Let's even give partners some equity. Let's give them a fraction of a small proportion of the equity while keeping 80% for ourselves. We'll distribute 20% to 20 people. And some people were okay with that. Some people weren't. But we saw that, even if equity was going to be distributed, it would be in this fashion. Decision making certainly wasn't being loosened up. And that was not a world that we felt that we wanted to live in or needed to accept. And perhaps we were, more independent minded than other people at the time. Perhaps we were more foolish and we were willing to take a risk. But we took this view that agar ye nahi chalega, koi naukri de dega. And in fact, many years later, after COVID, I was speaking to the head of Google in India at the time. Told me a really interesting story. So there came a period where suddenly the applications from the toppers at IIT to Google dried up. They weren't getting, and Google was the top employer for many years. People were queuing up to join them. So after one or two hiring cycles passed, they figured out that something is on. So they set out to investigate. And they went to try and find out and ask people about what was going on. So they asked some students, and people were giving them, fudgy kind of answers. Finally, they tracked one guy down and they said, please come to be interviewed. He said, I'm not going to join you. But they said, please come anyway. So he came and he was interviewed. And they asked him at some point, why are you not applying to us? And why are other toppers not applying to us? He said, all of us are setting up startups. And they said, yes, but startups are risky. He said, okay, if I set up a startup and if I fail, in 2 years, will you not give me a higher salary than you would if I'd just been in your system for 2 years? They said, yes. He said, there you are. So it was similar that we were also thinking that, look, we'll have got some experience. We didn't think that we'd get a higher salary, but we knew that we'd get a job. So that wasn't a fear. And also we were young and foolish.
There's a beautiful phrase I learned a few months ago from an essay by Janan Ganesh, partial outsiders, right? And his theory was that a particular effective kind of person in every domain is a partial outsider. They are outsiders in the sense that they're not completely off the system, and therefore, they are not bound by the conventional dogmas of the system, and they can think differently and think out of the box. But at the same time, they're not complete outsiders. They are partial because they have one foot in the game and they can make an influence, and they're kind of there. And I'm just thinking aloud that in that moment of time was perhaps in that window of time in the 90s were perhaps the only window of time where you could have partial outsiders in law. And I'm thinking that you guys were those because you didn't come from a law family background and a notion of what a law firm looks like, and therefore this is what a firm always looks like and I can't think of it any other way. So you were not bound by those conventional dogmas, but at the same time only partial because you are actually lawyers and you are actually working in these firms, but you can think differently. And I'm again thinking aloud, and I could be very wrong, but I'm thinking that window of opportunity would probably not exist today. But at that moment where after liberalization there is a lag between the world changing and the law firms catching up with the changing world, that there was a tremendous opportunity which was perfect for a partial outsider to come in and make an impact.
I think it was perfect for us to come in and make an impact, and I really like the idea of the partial outsider. To set up a firm that could scale and become very big. But it is now the norm for many people to spend some years in a law firm and set up on their own. Many, many, many firms in the last 20 years have been set up like that. And in fact, I have discovered that, and many of these firms, as you were saying, many people have not got family backgrounds in the law. They are first-time lawyers, first-generation lawyers, and they've also set up on their own. And I think we can take some of the credit for it because we've achieved quite a lot of success through that model, and other people feel that they can achieve success through that model as well.
No, what I'm saying is, why I wouldn't call them partial outsiders is that you guys change the conventional thinking on what a firm can look like. So someone who forms a trilegal kind of firm with that kind of partnership structure is actually doing something what is conventional now because you guys made it so.
Fair enough, yeah. But just the setting up of law firms is still going on. And it's, in fact, if you look at the top 100 firms today, out of the top 100 firms, the vast majority will be first generation firms. But in the top 10, the vast majority are still family firms, family or individual dominated firms.
Fair enough. So let's take a quick commercial break, and on the other side of the break, let's continue the Trilegal story. Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I loved the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercised my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm still chatting with Akshay Jaitley, and we are still talking about Trilegal, and we've barely kind of gotten to the point where the firm is getting off the ground. The six of you are doing different things in different places. You are some of you know some of you, but all of you don't know all of you, and
well put
so on and so forth. And eventually the idea of the firm comes up after some bonding over an India-Australia match of 1996 and a wine I can't pronounce, but you know, I live in Paris, so you will no doubt be able to do it. Chateauneuf du Pape. So
no, that's the Punjabi in you coming out. It's not Pape, it's du Pape. It's Chateauneuf du Pape, which literally means the new castle of the Pope.
Wow. Which is actually the perfect name for a wine to brainstorm a new firm like this. So
it's because, you know, there was a time when the popes moved to Avignon in France, and Chateauneuf du Pape is near Avignon.
Yeah, well,
not near, but in that general area.
If they shifted to Punjab, it could actually be Chateauneuf du Pape.
Yeah.
but so tell me about that. I mean, I'm also intrigued by the delightful story of how you and Rahul Mathan, who's also been on the show, a fantastic guy, how you guys came to know each other and, you know, were pussyfooting around each other in the early days, and then eventually you bonded over cricket, and then eventually sometime after that, you are drunk on wine and you decide to start something on your own. So just take me through that process. And
yeah, so I was working in my first job as a lawyer was in London. I was working in an English firm, and there was a deal which was a cross-border deal based in India, where I was quote unquote the English lawyer on the deal, and Rahul was the Indian lawyer on the deal. And both of us were a year or two into the profession and didn't know much about anything. But we had been handed these deals by our bosses because the deal was relatively small and, in their eyes at least, probably not as important as various other things. So we'd been entrusted to do the deal on our own. And we had to speak to each other every now and then. And both of us, this was before the internet, so you couldn't Google anyone and figure out who this person is. You had no idea who it was that you were speaking to, how old they were, how knowledgeable they were. You had no clue. So we were just being cautious because each one of us thought that the other guy was much more experienced. So we were being careful and being polite, and but again, because of the lack of internet, India was playing Australia in Bangalore, and I called him and I was desperate to know what was going on in the match, and I called Rahul and said, "What's the score?" And we realized that we like cricket, and we were both a bunch of fresh-faced chaps who didn't know much about the legal profession or the deal that they were doing, and were both learning together. And we were both hardworking, we were both curious, and we got along well, and we worked on that deal together. He came to London for another matter. We met then, got along well, and then I was sent on secondment to Dua Associates in Delhi. I continued to work on the deal. When we were closing the deal is when Rahul came up from Bangalore. We were working on the closing together. And the client was a lovely guy called Phil Moyes, will never forget him, who trusted us both to be working on this transaction when he deserved slightly more senior lawyers than us. But we managed to get the deal across the line. On the other side was the formidable Udayan Bose, who set up Lazard in India and a great investment banker. So we were at the closing dinner, and then the client bought us a bottle of wine, and after we'd already drunk one, and he left. And the bottle of wine happened to be a Chateauneuf du Pape. And we then drank a second bottle of wine, just the two of us. And I feel very bad for people who don't drink, because when you do, sometimes it opens up possibilities that otherwise are not available to you. It's not an advertisement to become an alcoholic or anything, but open your mind up to the possibilities of what could happen with a little bit of liquid encouragement is, I think, not a bad idea from time to time. So we, tongues loosened, and we chatted to each other about what we wanted to do, and both of us, it turned out, I wanted to come back to India and do something on my own because I didn't want to join the traditional firms. He was on his way out of Dua Associates anyway, and we sort of had the closest to a blood pact of doing something together, and said, let's do something together. And 2.5 years later, we did. We kept in touch during that period. And during that period, we gathered together Anand Prasad, who was at Dua Associates as well, Sridhar Gorthi and Karan Singh, who were at Lexind in Bombay, Prem Ayappa, who was working in Khaitan in Bangalore, Rahul's classmate. And we got this group of people together through a series of conversations. And, there were so many leaps of faith, and I talk about leaps of faith in the book, that all of us took with each other, possibly again because we didn't feel that we had that much to lose, and that it sounded like a good idea. So we then, I hadn't met, say again, I write about this, and I hadn't met Karan until our first meeting, when we were sitting down to decide how we would structure the firm. And we were going on the basis of what Rahul and Sridhar were saying about Karan, that he's the right sort of guy to have as a co-founder. So yeah, all of this happened over a period of a couple of years. So we were being reasonably patient. Rahul did break off and set up on his own Mathan Law Offices, which still, Mathan Law Offices still is the registered holder of Trilegal.com. So it's a massive area of risk for Trilegal that Rahul Mathan still controls the Trilegal domain name.
So if Rahul goes rogue, you're in trouble.
If Rahul goes rogue, we're in trouble. But I think, I'm wondering whether we would be allowed to sue him for the domain name, because Trilegal is much bigger than Rahul Mathan now, or any one of us.
He could sell it to someone from that area in Brazil. Like you point out, there's an area in Brazil where Trilegal means something else.
Trilegal.
Trilegal. What
Trilegal means very cool.
Very cool.
So when I discovered this a few years into the firm, it was a source of boundless delight, which you can probably still see on my face today.
Yeah, no, very cool indeed. And as you mentioned liquid encouragement in your book, you quote Louis Pasteur saying a bottle of wine contains more philosophy than all the books in the world. But one could also argue more useless philosophy sometimes than all the books in the world. Nothing good has ever come out of it for me, but I'm happy for you. One of the chapters I found most enlightening is when you speak of the founding values. And I'm actually going to ask you to kind of do what you've done in the chapter, in fact, and double click on sort of each of them. And I want you to talk about not just the value itself and how you were planning to implement it within the firm, but why did you feel it was important? Like what in your previous experiences foregrounded this as something that you should pay attention to? The values being equality and respect, meritocracy, ambition, client centricity, and firm-mindedness and fraternity. So, we can start wherever. Equality and respect.
So I think,
like, first of all, why did you feel that you needed founding values of this sort?
I think there's this sense that the various other options that existed in the market, we hadn't seen an expression of values that, or even if they were values, they were perhaps lip service. They were values that were not necessarily practiced. So we said, okay, if we want to do something different, we should have the framework or the basis on which how are we different? How are we doing something different? Let's write down how we believe we want to be different genuinely, not just platitudes. I think it was a real help that there were 6 of us. If there were 2 or 3, we may not have needed to do it so much. It would have seemed a bit performative to write down values. But when there's 6 of you, equality matters. It is important to say that each one of us is going to be equal. When there are 2, it's given. Maybe even when there are 3. So it's important to say those things. Respect, because we felt that again, if you don't treat people as equal in some ways, you are in some ways disrespecting them. So the respect also in terms of, we've all lost our tempers at work, and that's not a good thing. But the idea is to be respectful to your colleagues internally, and as much as possible. And at least, if you disrespect should be the exception. The norm should be that you're being respectful. So it was important to have equality and respect as that. Then client centricity, because we felt that there were many ways in which a lot of the big firms at the time were leaving something on the table in terms of client service. There was a bit of sort of best described as dheelapan in the way that clients were serviced. Emails were answered after days, deadlines were missed by weeks sometimes, and we felt that was just very easy for us to do. Email comes, just reply. And actually, going one step back, why wasn't that email being replied to? Because there wasn't the incentive for the lawyer to do it, because they were not sort of integrated well into the life and the future of the firm. They didn't necessarily see the benefit or draw the straight line between them answering the email and their own futures or their own careers. So client centricity meant that. And also, that's one part of it. And the other part of it is not to give academic advice. Here, if someone asks you a question, try and think about why they are asking you that question. What is the business objective they're trying to achieve? Put yourself in the shoes of the client. Also say, if a Japanese client is asking me a question versus the general counsel of a Fortune 500 company, American company, I'm going to give a different type of answer because I want it to land correctly. I have some conception about how hierarchies in Japanese Japanese companies work. So if I know that it's going to be passed up the line, so I should give the advice in a way that it's easy for the person who I'm sending the email to pass it up the line and it be digested in that fashion, versus in a US general counsel or a legal function in a US firm who's going to take the decision, or they'll convey what the idea is to their commercial colleagues and they'll take a decision. There's a different form of empowerment. So putting yourself in the shoes of the client while giving the advice and thinking about how they'd like to receive it, that was another part of it. The firm before self, which was a slightly cheesy way of saying, collegiality, but we'd seen the word collegiality used a lot, so we deliberately didn't want to use it. And the idea there was that, remind yourself that you're part of something bigger and that it's not just for yourself. Although that was very much a reason why we set up the firm, which was to set up something bigger than just a collection of individuals. It was important to state that, and that, to my mind, has really been the shining star, the North Star of our entire value system, is the fact of firm before self. In some ways, the others almost all follow from that.
And meritocracy and ambition were two of the
yes. So meritocracy was a simple one. I mean, if reward people for how good they are, and that reward doesn't necessarily isn't only just financial reward, but promotion, progression through the system, responsibility, giving people direct access to clients, etc. Ambition was something that was perhaps a bit different and not and unusual for the time, because we were precocious. We said we feel that we have the ability to be as good as the best law firm in the country, and we thought that some of the work that we were already doing was of high quality and competitive. We didn't know what that would translate into over a period of time in terms of size, market stature, structure, etc. But we felt that we were onto a good thing, and that we should aim to compete, if not in size and revenue, at least in terms of transactions. We should be considered for the same work as our biggest competitors. And we thought of that very early, before anyone knew who we were. So that was, I think, quite ambitious of us.
And a lot of these, the emphasis on firm before self, or collegiality, the emphasis on meritocracy, a lot of these depends on the kind of incentives that you have, and those incentives are, baked into the structure of any firm, right? And the obvious flaw in the firms before this is that the glass ceiling is very low. As you pointed out, you stand up and you've hurt your head. So give me a sense now. Again, in the book, you've outlined it beautifully, all the historical structures that exist and how they've evolved. There is a lockstep model, there is a eat what you kill model, and there are other variants which combine these. So take me through the different models that typically exist on how you can structure a law firm to make sure that everyone is incentivized to put in everything, to share the work around, to not compete too much internally, which can create a toxic environment. What are the different ways of thinking about this? What are the structures that existed historically? How was that evolving? And what was your thinking as you thought through all of these structures and tried to figure out what you should be?
So, broadly speaking, the questions you ask yourself is, do you want to reward a partner on the basis of the work they do? Or do you want to reward a partner on the basis of the work that the firm does? And the first leads you towards an eat what you kill kind of model. So many firms, and let me preface this part of the discussion by saying that no firm really follows a pure version of any one of these models. They are ideals that have been used in the past, but today there has been a sort of a gentle movement towards the center, with firms at various parts of at various points on the spectrum. So the thing with eat what you kill is in some ways, it's very meritocratic. You're very good. You do great work. Clients flock to you. Work comes to the firm. You pass on the work to other partners within the firm, and therefore you should be rewarded for that. That sounds quite fair. At the same time, if you're thinking of a collection of human beings in a knowledge kind of business, in an intellectual business, it can be demotivating to see someone being compensated enormously and you not being, because merit is a loaded word. Why are you getting all that work? Is it because you were born into a family with lots of connections? Is it because you're practicing in your practice area is such that it's doing very well right now, and there's lots of work coming in? Or is it that practice area historically gets higher fees than another practice area? Could be a number of reasons. So it's not because you are the smartest person in the room that you're earning the most amount of money. And also, especially once you build a bit of a structure, there is some amount of work that is coming in because of the brand and the platform, because the client is comfortable with the structure. So we felt that therefore the eat what you kill wasn't for us. Also, for a startup firm, if we'd been compensating each other, we did have different abilities to both service and bring in work at the time. We would have created friction between us that we wanted to avoid. We didn't know what that friction would have been. We didn't know who would have done better than the other, but inevitably it would have happened like that. So we said we'd rather go for a lockstep where we'll share equally. And initially, for the first few years, we were on different balance sheets in each city because we didn't know how it was going to play out, both amongst all of us as well as the cities vis-a-vis each other. And that turned out to be sensible because it gave us the opportunity to get comfortable with each other and then take a leap of faith, even when we were not all at the same financial kind of level. But we said, look, it doesn't matter. There's a bit of a delta. It'll even out over time. And thank God we did it, because there is no doubt that it's evened out more or less over time. Delhi might have had a little more work in the beginning, but it didn't take long for Bombay to catch up and become bigger, because Bombay is the financial capital. Once we started working with banks and financial institutions, there's a different quality and type of work which pays more that starts coming in. But, to give you an example, jumping forward, we do an enormous amount of M&A work today for private equity firms and for other kinds of funds in the energy and infrastructure space. Now, energy and infrastructure work traditionally commands lower fees than work for PE firms and for funds. But if it wasn't for our deep knowledge in energy and infrastructure, we wouldn't be getting that acquisition work. So if you were doing an eat what you kill, the work might come to the PE partner, but it would not have come to them but for the fact that you have an excellent sectoral practice. So we felt that these kinds of differences, relationships, correlations, dependencies would be better captured in a model where we put everything into a pot and shared it according to a number of points that people were allocated, and that's why we put it in. That's why we went for the lockstep. We did, however, say we'd have salaried partners to start off with, because at that time, people were becoming partners at 7 years qualified. And even today, in firms in which they are salaried partners, they become partners at around 7 years qualified. For us, it's 10 years, because we don't have the 3-year waiting period of salaried partnership that the other firms have before they get considered for equity. They may not even get equity at 10 years. They might remain salaried partners for longer in certain firms. So we wanted to be able to make partners early enough so that we could be competitive. Remember that we were nobody then. Where would somebody come and join us? And we were saying, no, we'll make you partner later than the bigger firms in the market. They said, why should we come and work with you? So we had this hybrid system, but effectively we thought of ourselves as a lockstep firm. We thought of ourselves as a firm where everything goes into a pot, where there are partners at various points on a ladder. The founders were capped at a certain number of points, and that a new equity partner joins at the bottom of the ladder, gets new points every year until such time that they reach the top of the ladder and the same level as the founders. And importantly, we didn't keep any founders equity. We always had one, and we always had one partner, one vote. Nobody voted their shares. We just voted yourself.
So you've demystified this very beautifully in the book. I'll just quickly paraphrase for the sake of the listeners, and you can correct me if I get anything wrong. But a lockstep model is basically this, that you're going to have partners who get equity, and all your equity is divided, say, into points. And there are different tiers. So there's, one tier of partners, perhaps the founding partners or the senior most partners, who get like 50 points. And that is a share of the overall equity and therefore the profits and whatever. And the starting tier could be like 10 points. And firms will often have this system where every year you get 3 or 4 points added on to your 10 points. So you spend a certain amount of time and you eventually get to 50. And this is an incentive A towards longevity and loyalty, because the longer you stay, that's when the big rewards really kick in. B, it's an incentive towards thinking of the firm's growth over your own, because you are, after all, getting a share of the equity. One illustration of this is early on, you point out that I think Rahul, through one of his friends, got an inquiry for some power sector thing, and he immediately passed it on to you guys in Delhi, even though at that time the billing arrangements were such that he wouldn't be, his part of the business would not be profiting.
Yeah, it was telecom and power mixed.
Yeah. So, which may not necessarily, he might have done it anyway, but in the eat as you kill kind of situation, it would not have been incentivized in the same manner. So these are the plus points, but the negative points also are that the meritocracy dulls a bit among the partners, because if it's going to be like a fixed 3 points or 4 points a year, somebody who is an outstanding performer doesn't get rewarded for performing outstandingly, and you can just kind of coast your way through that. And there might be senior partners who are getting 50 points but are complacent and they're not really earning their keep, so to say. So there are other sort of incentive problems, which is why, as you pointed out, no firm actually is one or the other. It's a sort of a hybrid, because you're kind of balancing for all of this. And the Indian firms, you pointed out that the equity came very late. A lot of people who were so-called partners were only getting a salary, and this actually mitigated against the firm's growth, because if the firm, for example, as you pointed out later, if the firm had to invest in new technology or new infrastructure or whatever, this would militate against the interests of the salaried partners, because this would affect their performance bonuses, because there would be less of a pool for that. So it's this complex interplay of incentives. So tell me about what your first structure was. It's changed during the years at different times, and we'll come to that. But when you began, what is the first structure that you arrived at? Like, one of the things that you did, which is completely drastic and which only outsiders could have thought of, is that this wasn't inheritable, that a partner got the equity they did, but if they died, that's it. It would go back to the company and it would not go to their kids.
Retired, anything.
It left the company, retired. It's back to the company. It's not going to their kids, which is a phenomenal phenomenal sea change. It seems completely radical to me even today. What were all the considerations you were taking about how to balance these, and what did your first initial starting structure therefore look like?
So one thing I should, be careful about saying is that we didn't invent this structure. It existed in
Sure,
the
sure.
West. So we were looking at the options available and saying what suits us instinctively, the people we are, the kind of firm we want to build, what suits us better with those parameters, considerations in mind. So as I said, part of it we've already discussed, but what equity means within our firm is just a ticket for a certain share of the profits while you're there. So we don't ask when people are given equity, they're not charged for that equity. That keeps the barriers for entry relatively low. You don't have to come from a family with money to be able to pay for your equity, or it's not taken out of your salary as a soft loan repayment. Therefore, your headline salary might look like it's 100, but it's actually 70 because 30 is being taken back in equity. It also, if you create too much value within the firm, then the value of the equity then prevents, it becomes more and more difficult to let new people into the partnership, even laterally. So if you get a senior lateral with a great book of business, but who hasn't made a huge amount of savings in their life, they're not going to be able to come in to the equity. So you want them to you want that option to remain open in a country where even though we are all part of the 1%, even though cash wise the 1% didn't have a lot of money in those days, not a lot of cash in hand. So you might have been in the top 1%, but it didn't translate into disposable income. So that was one part of it, and the reason to not make it heritable was because we wanted to get away from the idea that it's a family firm, and we felt that if we did well, and it's been borne out to be true, that we'd earn more than enough in our careers to be very, very comfortable, and we'd also create wealth for a much larger number of people. Which would allow us to grow. And that has been spectacularly borne out because there are 150 partners in the firm today. They are all going to be wealthy people. I, in fact, joke with some of the younger partners to say, you're going to be much richer than me because the value of the point today is much higher than the value of the point used to be 15 years ago. So you are able to put more money away. They turn around and say, well, inflation. So I think, but you get the point. The point is that you want to create the wealth, and you know that you're going to have more than enough. So it's not that we've been saints. But one of my younger partners asked me a couple of years ago, how much more money would you have made if you'd kept just 10% founders' equity between the 5-6 of you? So I said probably about twice as much. Over all of those years, that 10% would have translated into a lot. But we wouldn't have created an institution because people would have said, or had the ability to say, the difference between them and the others is only one of degree. The others keep 50%, these have kept 10%, but the principle is still the same. No one can say that. So, and it's important that no one can say that because that bleeds into the culture of the firm. The culture of the firm, therefore, is, even for us, we have to keep ourselves relevant. You were saying earlier, the complacency that can build in with a partner at the top of the lockstep, just, sitting and watching the world go by. We feel the need to do something of value for the firm and do that in a variety of different ways as we become more and more senior. And now there are several partners in the firm who are at the same level of equity as the founders, not one or two, and there will be more and more. So the other reason not to have the firm, pay back for the equity later is as people retire, when you have more senior partners, it's a huge financial burden on the firm. You have to then create reserves to repay partners as a sort of retirement payment for their equity, as opposed to distributing those profits on a day-to-day or year-to-year basis.
So, Tell me about how this evolved over time. Like I'm cheating on chronology a little bit because there's a lot of stuff about this early period that I want to talk about. Your experiences with Kashmiri carpet sellers, toilets, and so on and so forth. But just sticking with the structure, there are various points in the narrative. 2008, when three of your junior partners leave the firm to start off on their own, and they're unhappy, and the cause for their unhappy again has to do with the structure. Equally, 2012. And equally through time there have been little changes happening. So take me through these points of rupture and what they taught you, because at one level it indicates that, hey, great structure, forward thinking, very different for India, but holes, you discover holes in it not by thinking about what could be wrong with it, but through events happening. So take me through some of those.
Well, there have been slightly different causes for those different difficulties, and some of them are connected. But I'll just touch upon something that I dwell on a bit in the book, which is this constant balance that you need to strike in a lockstep between meritocracy and collegiality, because everybody is happy with the idea of some extra recognition for exceptional performance, and those who are actually performing exceptionally do not necessarily want to be rewarded exceptionally. They also want to be rewarded somewhat. At least that has been my experience. People don't want to be rewarded proportionally to their exceptional performance. Because they also recognize that can rock the boat, and the boat is a stable one that they are benefiting from. So sensible person will recognize that every now and then you'll get somebody who's not happy with it. That's human nature, and but you can't design a system for the 5 or 10% of people who are going to always be unhappy with it. You have to design it for the 90% who will always likely to be happy with it. So that's been one reason for tweaking and for misalignment at sometimes at various points during our history. But the 2008 problem was a different type of problem. It's a sort of problem which we later discovered often happens in first generation firms, is that the immediate next generation usually feel dissatisfied with the rewards that they're being given, because they feel that they may well have been associates to start off with, but they were there when it started, and they took in their own eyes, they took some of that risk. And they are not being rewarded. So what we did is, when we set up our lockstep, we were at the top of it, and we put the next partners, who were salaried partners at the time, we put them at the bottom of the lockstep, because that seemed logical to us. Because the whole idea was salaried partners join at the bottom of the lockstep. Now, they felt at the time that might well be the system, but we've been there from the beginning, so we should be treated somewhat exceptionally. There is. I don't think that reasonable people can agree with both sides of this picture. We took a view that we took a view not on the basis of the fairness of the model, but we took actually a rule of law type of approach. We said, this is our system, and if we cut special deals for people today, we will always be cutting special deals. People will say, why not for me? So we took the view that we wouldn't do it. It was very, very painful. These guys left. And I talk in detail about, emotionally, you're 8 years into setting up a firm. These are the first guys you've made up partner. These are the first guys you've given equity to. And in your own head, you're thinking, one of the reasons why I've set up the firm is exactly for guys like this. They look and feel like us. They've learnt with us. They've grown with us. We are sort of partly doing it for them, and they're saying, go to hell. We don't like your system. But we learned that this often happens with the first generation, who has this sense of having contributed more than perhaps the founders do.
And as you point out, one of your partners, Sridhar, was at that time going up Mount Kilimanjaro, and when you broke the news to him that this was final, these three guys were leaving, he wept alone in his tent. You were telling me before this that we are recording this on Jan 17th, but the episode will probably come out in March or April, I don't know when. So maybe by that time this would already have happened, but you said that people have been speaking to you about making a web series out of this, which I sincerely hope happens, because it is full of dramatic moments, and one of those dramatic moments is this, and I can totally imagine it. Like, Like, this is like a cold open to one of the episodes, that there is a tent and there is snow, and somewhere then there is a sound of a phone ringing, and somebody picks up the phone and he says, yeah, okay, whatever, something, and then the line is cut, and all the time the camera is moving in slowly, slowly. So the tent was a speck in the snow, and now you move in, and then you gradually get inside the tent, and there is a grown man sitting there and crying. And what a remarkable scene this would be. Like, the Trilegal story will just be such an awesome, I'm willing to advise you on story and structure if you should kind of need it. It's a fantastic scene. You articulated some of the founding values that you picked for yourself, but an expression of those values, if not values by themselves, are coming up later in some of the decisions that you take. Like, you've spoken about how in the early days, for example, you decided that you are not going to go in for any tax saving schemes, or, take payment in cash from anyone, or even take clients like that who have large amounts of cash. You also decided that you're not going to take any assets for your office, that everything is going to be rented, from the property to the furniture. You made a bunch of governance decisions, that there'll be one partner, one vote, and so on and so forth. And I'm just thinking, and all these are also reflective of values. And I'm just thinking that there is also then a part dependence to these, that the values you set right at the start then have a part dependence. They become the culture of the company. And if they are, adhered to, which is why I totally get that rule of law argument for the 2008 situation. And you also pointed out that Rahul made the good argument at that time that, listen, they may be the same age and all that, but we are the founders. We took that freaking existential risk and they didn't. And that also matters, and I completely buy that. But to come back to the question, that the values that you set have a part dependence. And in hindsight, it's very easy to say that, look, you have a great firm today because you happen to have the right set of values at that time. But going into it, in the fog that would have been around you, were you sort of also aware of the longer term implications of the decisions you were taking, or you just went with what felt right to you in that moment?
No, I think it is the latter. I don't think that any of us were that mature to think that that they would be, or to imagine what the long-term implications would be, other than the fact that there would be some long-term implications which wouldn't be good if we didn't stick to our principles. So there was a sense that this is the right thing to do. It in the long term, it will be the right thing to do, even if today it's slightly difficult. And it was very difficult, actually, in the moment, some of those decisions. So but I don't think we had sort of mapped out that, okay, if we do this, then we'll become a different kind of firm. It just instinctively was apparent that it was the right thing to do. And in the longer term, in general, these things play out, favorably.
You had another huge, again, I'll skip a little bit and then I'll come back to the early years. But going back to the question of structure, you had another huge rupture circa 2012, where, you had a survey carried out and many of the partners were unhappy, and you actually listened to the feedback and changed fundamental things about the company based on that. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, we'd sort of noticed, as you were suggesting, that because we had one partner, one vote, even for the salaried partners, that when we were making decisions about spending money, the salaried partners were not so keen, because it was going to be coming out of their bonuses. And theoretically, it's also coming out of the profit distribution of the equity partners, but we were getting paid more, so that delta meant less. So we decided we'd do a survey and see where we were and take stock. And it wasn't that there was a crisis. There wasn't a feeling of crisis. There was a feeling of unease. There's a feeling that, something isn't quite okay. But the survey results were shocking. The survey results were that for more than 50%, 60, 70% unhappiness on various different types of parameters of firm management, of alignment, of the idea, the direction of the firm, various different types of issues, while at the same time people were very happy with the reputation of the firm, the work they were doing, how they were learning, etc. So there was a lot that was going right, but there were internally there were things that were going wrong. So we decided to have a sort of moderated conversation through a survey conducted by a third party. And these survey results led us towards the thought that we need to create greater alignment. And we sort of did a fairly simplistic thing. We said the guys who are at salaried partnership, the salaries they're getting is roughly equivalent to 5 points. So instead of going from 10 to 40 points, which is what our lockstep is, let's just convert their salary into points and start them off on a lockstep from day one. And when the consultant suggested this, we were pretty excited with it because instantly we could see how the alignment would be created. What it meant, and we didn't necessarily think about that immediately, but it very quickly we caught on to it, was the fact that now the selection of the partners would have to be that much more strict. Because if you're going to give them equity from day one, they better be pulling their weight, which is one of the reasons why we've also moved from 7 years to 10 years, because it takes that long for a lawyer to mature, to be able to not only service a client and manage a relationship with the client, do the work, manage a team and all of that, but also to have the gravitas and the status to pull in the sufficient amount of revenue that would justify them getting those 5 points. So, and little by little, people have adjusted to that idea because they know that the trilegal partnership means equity partnership, and it means more. And you're basically, unless you screw up, you're basically getting it for your entire career.
In fact, one illustration of how all the incentives were in place is you have a chapter on the Amarchand Mangaldas split towards the end of the book, and you point out about how this massive law firm splits into two, and then there is massive churn because partners are moving from one place to the other, and it is just complete chaos. But despite that, not one single partner moved away from Trilegal during that period, and that just shows you that the incentives were so great that they didn't have to. How does the system look today, and what were the further kind of evolutions in that system?
Yeah, it sort of, again, you said something a little while ago about values and how values translate into culture. I think that's very much the case, but we have an important sort of other component in that, which is the values were written into a contract, which is the partnership deed, which is accessible to all partners. It's changed many times, but the values effectively create the structure which is written down, and that values structure contract culture. And I don't think that over time, just the goodness of people's hearts will maintain values and will support culture. Writing it down was important, and I think it's good for people to know that it's written down. And of course, written words are subject to interpretation, but in general, it's pretty clear that what our values are and how that translates into structure, and then the culture is downstream of that.
And it's really the translation into structure that matters. Like Ambedkar's argument, a lot of people don't realize that the preamble that they wave around is really Indira Gandhi's version of it, that the original preamble did not have the word secular and socialist. And he made strong arguments against including both of those words, Ambedkar did. And his argument against the word secular was that secularism is inherent in every little thing in our constitution. We don't need to virtue signal to spell it out. I'm paraphrasing, he didn't use the term virtue signal, but we don't need to actually do this kind of posture and put the word there. It is embedded in the structure of our constitution anyway. So in that similar sense, I guess your structure embedded the equality, the meritocracy, the firm before self, and you didn't actually need these words to be in there, right?
Yeah, so that's why those words don't appear in anything that we write down. We've got it written down in a value statement, but it doesn't appear in any document that anyone can enforce. But you were asking about how the structure looks today. There's some important elements that we've added to it, which we feel amplify, or they're sort of nuanced versions of the same values. So, for instance, in order to progress through the lockstep, there are two important and fairly obvious components that anyone can understand. One is, the work that you do in any particular year. So we don't give people more points on the basis of them hitting a target each year. We give them more points each year, other than in some gateway years where they have to, which are important, where you look back and see whether they've hit the targets in the period that preceded. So the manner in which you can make up that number, the number that you need to achieve your target, is partly through the work that you do, and you also get 50% credit for work that you pass on to other partners. Now, importantly, this is the 50% credit isn't translating into money. It's translating into points. through at a gateway, because if it was money, it would be double counting, because somebody else has actually billed the work that you've passed on to them. And as you become more and more senior in the lockstep, the proportion that you can use to achieve your target through work that you've referred to other partners increases. So the point is, what are you building for others becomes more important than what you're doing for yourself. Then at two key points, at 16 and 24 points, you have to get through those gateways or to the next level there, you have to have made up another partner from within your practice. The point being that any partner, however good they might be, they can only do so many hours in a year, and they can only supervise X number of lawyers, and that number may be somewhere between 5 and 8 lawyers. It's very hard to supervise more lawyers than that and still get good quality work. So how do you grow beyond that? You grow by creating another partner out of your practice who then is subject to the same system and the same progression through the lockstep as you are, and who presumably will also perform well and move through the ranks and add to the pie. So that was a very important element that we brought in around 2017, which then creates that further incentive to grow the pie, and that's very much a firm before self. So it incentivizes people to train their lawyers well, so that when they become partner, they can hit the ground running. So it on paper, the alignment of incentives is fantastic. Human beings, again, are human beings. It doesn't always work as smoothly as that. But I think no one can put their hand on their heart and say that if they don't make it through a gateway, it's very clear to someone as to why they didn't. They may feel upset about the fact that they didn't, but they will know why they didn't. So the system works pretty well, I think.
And what about lateral partners? Like, one thing that you did throughout is that whenever there was a suitable person in an outside firm who was a partner there, you'd bring him in as a lateral partner. But then that has a possibility of creating complications with junior partners within your own firm who might feel that, hey, what the hell, I've been here for 10 years and that guy just parachuted in from somewhere else and it's not fair, etc., etc.
Well, it has to be justified. We don't bring in lateral partners and hand them work from within the firm. Lateral partners have to come generally with their own work. We have to build a case. The management committee builds a case for a lateral partner. The case is documented. We talk in the case about there's a file that's prepared on the lateral partner who's joining with a detailed explanation of what their practice looks like, who their clients are, what their revenues are likely to be, and importantly, what the portability of their clients is going to be. Are the clients going to move or are they going to stay? You can't force any client to move with a partner. So we actually speak sometimes to clients and say, look, X person is going to join us. Will you come with them? And they will tell you yes or no, or they'll say, look, I'll continue to give some work to the firm there, but I'll give you some of my new work, whatever that discussion is. That all of this is put into a document, presented to the board. The board then endorses it or says, ask for more information. It's only when the board clears it can it be put up to the partnership, and then the entire partnership votes on the basis of that. And you also, in that document, we also say how many points that person is going to get. So every lateral partner doesn't join at the bottom of the lockstep. If they got a substantial practice, they're senior in the profession, they have an ability to pass on work and build relationships for other partners, they may come on at a very senior level in the lockstep. But that is all put out and that's voted on. So we've never had a situation in which a lateral partner's case has been voted down.
Amazing. And, final question on the structure before we get back to the chronology. How has the ecosystem changed because of what you guys did? Like, you guys are, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but the number one law firm in the country, right? More or less.
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly. And so it's a grand success story, not just of a new firm, but of a new way of doing things. And how has this changed the industry? Have other people, changed the way they do things? The other firms that form, perhaps some of them with your people leaving to form new firms, do they adopt this model? Do they adopt variations of it based on what they have learned, etc., etc.?
Well, after the 2008 departures, we haven't really had too many people leave to set up new firms, that's one. And secondly, it's very hard to know what other people are doing. This is not something that people talk about openly. But actually, interestingly, after having written the book and some partners from younger firms reaching out and saying we've also adopted some of these methods, and thanks for putting out the formula, because we now have a more granular view of what it is that you guys have done. So I think that there's a desire to do it, and some of the younger firms probably have done things which approximate to what we've done, or at least substantially different from the models of command and control that some of the older firms have. And to be fair, some of the older firms have also made larger amounts of equity available and have also included more partners in aspects of decision making than perhaps they did in the past. And I'd like to think that we can take at least some credit for it. I don't think it's entirely because of us. I think the expectations of anyone joining the profession has changed, and maybe some of that is because of us, but I wouldn't take all credit for it. So I think the profession is better and fairer for the lawyers within it today than it has been in the past.
Let's talk about the early days of Trilegal. What was it like setting it up? Like in the web series, another cold open that I can imagine is that, you have the or 1 second, should you have the outside of the store, or should you just have a close-up of a Kashmiri carpet? You have a close-up of a faded Kashmiri carpet, and as it comes out, you see the whole of the store, and then you keep zooming out of the door and you see this dratty little store which sells Kashmiri carpets, and then at one point the door opens and a foreign lady appears out there looking not particularly happy, and a young Indian in a suit, perhaps the actor who's going to play you, whoever that is, then appears and escorts her off somewhere, and then you have the opening credits. And this is of course an early instance where you had a basement office, you weren't particularly proud of it, and you used to do all of your meetings in 5 stars, because if the client wanted to go to a toilet, they could, because 5 stars typically have toilets. But
no, we generally had a toilet. It was just that at that time we had to renovate it.
So it was a hole in the ground, so you had to take her to the Kashmiri carpet seller for the...
Well, and arguably, I think you do him an injustice, because arguably his showroom was fancier and nicer and certainly more valuable than our office was, because the value of the carpets in there was far more than the few tables and computers that we had in ours. It was, but he was incredibly nice about allowing us to use his toilet for a period of a month or so. But there are many such little stories, some of which I think we've even forgotten, because we were absolutely a startup, and it wasn't a garage, it was a basement, but it was very much, and it felt like that. It felt exciting. It felt like something new was starting. The world was your oyster. Anything could happen. Going out to a meeting to meet a potential new client was the height of excitement, and the feeling of getting a new client where they would turn around and say we are hiring you was, you were top of the world when that sort of thing happened. I still feel great when that happens, but I think you probably feel better about that when you have nothing, and when a fairly large corporation decides to work with you when you have no business expecting that they will. There's a different kind of maza in that.
When you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose, which is actually why young people do so many startups and not much older people. So tell me about those early days. What was your approach towards getting clients? And also now you're 3 separate offices. In fact, that's why you're called Trilegal to begin with. You couldn't come up with a name, and there were 3 offices. So Trilegal, none of you knew Portuguese, so that was not a factor. How did you kind of divvy it up? I was very interested in the part where you mentioned that the 3 of these almost ran as 3 separate operations, but there was a clear understanding that you will all be known, that you will all be part of Trilegal, that one entity will subsume everything, and that regardless of the business you bring in from each city, all the partners will be equal. So I'm very interested in how that played out, what the early days were like. How did you go about getting business? Tell me a bit about that.
It's we did it in all kinds of ways. You contacted friends. All of us had done some work for people in the past. There were clients who we'd worked with in other firms. Some of them were happy to come along. There were law firms we'd worked with overseas who knew us as individuals and were happy to send work. My old firm, Ashurst in London, sent us some work. And then we did some fairly innovative, interesting things. Me and Saket Shukla, who later left and formed Phoenix Legal, we invented an email address which was ajay.sagar@hotmail.com, based on Ajay Behel and Jyoti Sagar's name, to two of the doyens of the profession. And we wrote to the Lawyer magazine in London, and we said, look, this guy who used to work in London has set up a firm along with some other guys. Thought we'd want to know. And shockingly, they called us and did an interview with me. The interview appeared in their magazine, and somebody read that interview and sent us a piece of work. So we did all sorts of things to get work. We went on business development trips to Singapore, stayed with cousins, went to London, stayed on people's sofas, went to San Francisco, got chased out of a hotel by gunshots. All sorts of interesting things like this happened in the early days. But then gradually it's a relationship game. We started then developing relationships with other intermediaries, whether they were investment bankers, accountancy firms, different types of law firms internationally, because they're the gateway to multiple clients and not just a single client. So initially we used to get a lot of work from overseas. We used to get a lot of work from intermediaries. And one of the funnily enough, we got more work from people overseas because there was less baggage. They didn't care about the fact that we didn't come from an established name, or the firm hadn't been around for very long. They were interested in how we'd approach the matter that they were coming to us with. So those were some of the ways in which we got work in the early days, and then it sort of becomes a rolling ball that just gathers as it rolls down the hill.
And in 2008, you also started a big tie-up with an international firm, and take me through that process and the euphoria of that, and through this. Initially when you start out, you have all the hunger and the idealism of young people out on a journey. But then at some point you become successful. This can get to your head. This can corrupt the way you think about the world. This can lead to ego and therefore to ego issues and so on and so forth. Tell me also about this period of success, because by this time you were already very successful, which is why the tie-up happened in the first place. And then as the tie-up happened and you go through that, and now you are not slumming it anymore. You're going to international conferences. You're living the life. You've probably made your FU money already. Things not by then. But you're on your way, and things are great. Like, one of the things that I'm kind of surprised by is not that you got along so well at the start, but that you all stayed friends and you stayed together in a manner of speaking. Even if someone left, they left amicably. And I'm a little surprised at that, because power and success can corrode character and can change people and all of that. So give me a sense of these journeys and the frictions that might have arisen, and what did you observe within yourself during this period of time? Like, what didn't you like about the person that you were?
I think that's a bit of a strong way of putting it. I don't think I became more of a jerk than I might have been before. I think that, any personal arrogance that we might have been disposed towards having was tempered by the success of the firm. And the success of the firm was leading us towards, getting more wealthy and doing well and having a reputation. And we were sensible enough, I think, to see that if we let our egos get out of check, we would be killing the goose that was laying the golden eggs, and that didn't make sense. And that lack of hubris for that was, I think, I give ourselves some credit for it, but also we didn't. I think background to some extent matters. We came from families that were certainly modest in their values. We didn't come from moneyed backgrounds, etc. And this thing was doing well. Why are you going to rock the boat when you're doing well, when you're getting an increasingly better and better reputation? And the flip side of that is, if things had gone badly, it would have been worse and worse once you'd done better, once you were bigger. If you'd failed in the early few years, no big deal. But if you're going to fail after year 10, then that's going to be a big egg on your face. That the whole model, which is one of the reasons why 2008 was a was a blow, because it was a question of, is the model itself working or not? So I think perhaps that led us to circle the wagons a little bit and think a little harder about how we were treating our other partners. And that's one of the reasons why we led to that survey a few years later and took into account the views of other partners in 2012, which led us to make changes. So I think that experience of that blow was negative in one sense, but it perhaps also prevented us from developing the kind of hubris that would have led to worse individual behavior, and therefore something that would have threatened the organization.
And what did the tie-up with Allen and Overy do for the firm?
Oh, it was transformational. I'm very happy to admit that it was, for an 8-year law firm to do something with one of the world's top firms, just the fact of the relationship immediately catapulted us into, much higher echelons of the Indian legal world than we were in previously. Everyone said, who are these guys? And I'm happy to admit that there would have been many people who heard of us for the first time when this relationship happened. So, who are these fellows who've come from nowhere? But apart from reputation, the biggest benefits, I think, and some of the echoes of that are still there today, is in the manner in which we organized ourselves internally. So we developed a more professional finance function, an HR function. Knowledge management became more organized. Business development approaches changed. How do we we thought of developing a list of top clients and taking care of them in a slightly different kind of way. That didn't work so well, but various things that we put into place are still sort of the backbone of those departmental functions. Hiring professionals to head those functions, and over the years we've got better and better quality of professionals to do that. Those are the ways and also approaches to practice, precedents, better quality documentation, approaches, interesting things like approaches to the media. This is not something I wrote about in the book, but we actually did media training, that if you're asked questions by the media, how should you respond? Those kinds of things. So we became sort of grown-ups in a certain way, things that we didn't have the opportunity to work on or learn because we were just doing the work and trying to build a firm. So we had the luxury to step back and with the help of Allen Overy to develop some of these things. And in fact, later I talk about, one of the things that I talk about is lessons that we've learned through this period. One is to get a mentor, and we didn't have mentors, but perhaps for those 4 years, A&O was our mentor.
Tell me also about, how the transition was for you from running, for you guys, from sort of being part of a startup, running a startup, to running an institution that might have formed exactly as you envisaged it because of the incentives and the structure you put in place, but which was nevertheless now a very large firm. Like today you have 150 partners, and when it started it was the 6 of you and then the 5 of you after
and
one.
1,200 lawyers in all now.
And 1,200 lawyers in all now, whereas the biggest law firm in 30 years ago had like 150 lawyers, as you pointed out. So it's a whole different management challenge which you could not possibly have conceived of in the late 90s, because there were no firms like this in India, not even close. So, what was that process like? In your book, of course, you have detailed a lot of the management challenges that came, putting up a 3-member management committee, which eventually became a 2-member management committee, the battles that happened with the shifting of the guard, circa 2020, all of those, things were happening. So, what did you sort of learn about that? And at a personal level, where did you feel you were at home and in your comfort zone? And where did you feel that this is not for me? Like when the first management committee of 3 people was formed, you declined to be a part of it. One person from each city. Anand was a Delhi person, and even after he left in 2018, you didn't step in as might have been expected. You simply didn't want any part of that. So what was your image of yourself changing and morphing, and what was your comfort zone and what was not? How did all of this play out in your mind, your role in the company and the company's role for you?
Well, I don't like the idea of day-to-day management very much. I know it has to be done. I know it's critically important. I have a lot of respect for people who do it and for who do it well, but it's not for me. I'm not very good at it, largely because I don't want to do it. So, that usually happens, that you will do things half-heartedly, you will not do them well. My interest is in practice building. My interest is in, bringing in new clients. How do you service work, training people, building, creating better and better lawyers. That's something that is of greater interest to me. I'm more comfortable dealing with people in a positive way rather than in a negative way, and a lot of management involves that. You have, to do evaluations of your own partners, to tell your partners that they're not hitting their targets and therefore there's going to be bad news around the corner. That's not for me. Maybe you can say that is avoiding difficult conversations, but there are other types of difficult conversations that I have had. For instance, I'd never imagined when we set up that I'd have to sack so many people, which I've had to do over the years. A terrible thing to have to do, but you have to do it. You have to bite the bullet and do it. So I've been sort of always more interested in the more strategic, longer term planning, practice building, that sort of thing. And in things like training. So we set up these things called the Nimrana sessions, which were off-site training for freshers, which we still run in a significantly different form, but we still run it. Because we are one firm, it allows people at the absolute junior level to know their contemporaries in other offices. And if your boss tells you Bombay mein is cheez ka stamp duty ka rate kya hai, you can call your peer in Bombay and get the answer from them. Of course, now you can get it from ChatGPT, but
which might tell you the
wrong one. But you have a human being that you can relate to, who's your peer, and all things going well, maybe you'll be partners together, and then you'll have had a 10-year relationship. And that's always a good thing. So that's the sort of thing that I'm more inclined towards, and not formal management.
There's a ton in your book of great narrative. There are great small stories all along, etc., etc. It would make a great web series. However, I'll leave it to the readers to actually read the book and figure it out. I read it in one morning. It's an easy read. So well done on that, on making it such a smooth read. I don't think I'll be allowed to reveal anything about your next book, though from whatever you've told me, I am like twice as excited about it as I was about this. It sounds great. Let's now look at a bunch of different aspects in terms of A, the impact that Trilegal had, and B, the lessons that you drew from it, which apply to institution building. So first tell me about, and you already answered a part of this, but give me a sense of what impact has it had on the legal market per se. The huge success of, a firm which was founded at a time where firms had like a couple of hundred people lawyers at most, and, you have 10x, 15x that. So give me a sense of what is the impact you've had on the legal market, the legal ecosystem, and or how has the legal ecosystem actually changed? Because you may not want to, take credit or attribute causality for all of it to Trilegal, but how have things changed, and what has been your part in it?
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot. I think that the one word that comes to mind is that it's far more professional than it used to be overall across the board. The attitude towards client service is now world class in general. Competition has helped a lot. To that extent, if one firm is delivering service in a certain way consistently over time, then other people will need to match it and will match it over time. Good incentives make it easier, but there are other ways in which people can achieve the same outcomes potentially. So professionalism is one. I've said it again in the book. I think Indian lawyers today, Indian corporate lawyers are world class. An Indian lawyer or an Indian law firm could do a deal anywhere in the world, given, you may need a little local law advice because that's just something you don't know. But in terms of deal structures, contracts, negotiations, understanding client motivations, getting a deal across the line, I think Indian lawyers at the top end of the market are excellent. So that is something that has transformed over time. And you see it in the fact that the involvement of international law firms in India transactions has remained fairly, stable and low. It's not increased. Indian law firms are doing the biggest deals in the market when perhaps 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they were not. So that's a big change. I think salaries have gone up enormously for lawyers. So law firm lawyers are now very well paid. They are far more eligible as shadi prospects than they might have been when I became a lawyer 30 plus years ago. I think those are positive changes. In general, the changes to the law firm part of the legal profession have been quite positive. There are some there are some difficulties which relate to mental health, burnout. COVID was very bad for law firms. It was an enormously busy period for law firms. There was a huge amount of work. Initially, there was a drop for the first couple of months because people were just not doing deals. But then, for a variety of reasons, there was a lot of work. And working remotely, where you were available 100% of the time, it was a difficult period. Lots of people burnt out. There was a huge amount of attrition. At least for us, we've managed to control that now. And we've also learnt from it. The expectations of a generation today, the Gen Z, Alpha coming soon, is going to be different, are different. And you can't want it to be different just because it was हमने ऐसे नहीं किया था और हमने बहुत काम किया था and we never complained, etc., etc. You have to take into account the reality. That's something I think that we are getting better at, but all large institutions are going to lag a little bit from what the reality is, and you play catch up for a while before things become smooth across the board. So that's somewhere where there's perhaps something still to be done. And I think we've had some role in all of this. We've had some positive role in a lot of these developments that have taken place, but absolutely can't take credit for even the lion's share of the credit for it. No.
One of the things that you devote half a chapter to towards the end of the book is your approach to wider impact, which really interested me, because I'm thinking that if you're doing a startup, you are doing what you're doing. It is in and of itself a service to society, because obviously you only make a profit and you only make money if you make people better off, and that's all you need. And you've grown your firm and boom, you've succeeded, and why think about other things? But, all of you have thought about other things. All of you have tried to affect broader policy, especially Rahul, who's been a public intellectual, who's played a role in building digital public infrastructure and so on, played a big role there. You guys, Karan, and you have founded Trustbridge now, thought deeply about how do you enable pathways for women partners, how do you increase access to justice, how do you innovate within the system, etc., etc. So give me a sense of that. Like, first of all, where does this come from? Like, is this approach of going for wider impact, is it something that is in the DNA of Trilegal itself, or is it just that individual partners have done different things because they care about these particular issues?
I think partly it's human instinct. I think many people who are reasonably successful have this idea of giving back in some way, and we are not sort of unique in that. I think that the kind of firm that we are, because of the kind of people who have both founded it and joined it and been part of it, lend us to doing a certain kind of giving back. And I think the policy work, what Rahul does, what we do at Trustbridge, or what I do separately, the policy work is using your long-term skills for the greater good. You could take a cynical view and say all of this impact work is good for brand. So it is good for brand, and there's no harm in doing things that are good for brand, particularly if they're also good for other things. But I think it's just the instinct of people. I mean, and across the board you'll find, and even many firms will be doing similar things where they want to create an impact and improve the state of play of the country in a variety of different spheres based on both their skills, their interest, and the opportunity. So because again of the kind of people we are, I mean, Rahul instinctively went towards doing policy work in the tech space and became good friends with Nandan, who was doing a lot of this sort of stuff. So it lent itself to a deeper impact. So it's both in interest, opportunity, and the fact that for us in the firm now, if I were to think of it from the firm's perspective, it's brilliant to have somebody who's been deeply involved with the architecture of digital public infrastructure, which is definitely one of India's success stories for the last 10-15 years. So it's a good thing in and of itself. It feeds Rahul's instinct to use his skills to do better for the country, and it's great for the brand of the firm. So it's really a win-win. And if you think about it, the time and effort and money that is spent is really small, insignificant. if you take it in the context of the firm as a whole. So to have a few senior people with a bit of a reputation, with a bit of access, with a bit of a voice to be doing this sort of thing is in the interests of the firm. And the vast majority of our partners see that, and in fact have been encouraging us to do this sort of stuff. So please don't do deals. Leave that to us. Bring in the clients, pass them to us, and you guys please go and be the public image of the firm. And it's not just the founders, but various other partners are now moving in that direction themselves as they become, more and more experienced and have a say, have something to say rather on areas of practice which involve policy. And some of it is just philanthropy. There are young women lawyers, young women who want to become lawyers, and if you can help them become lawyers, why the hell wouldn't you do it? And there's very little skin off your nose to do it, so do it. I mean, it's sometimes it's not that deep.
And for my listeners, I'll point out that, Rahul's often got a bad rap for some of the work he's done in tech policy. And I think the bad rap is entirely unjustified. He's a fantastic intellectual and guy. He's done an episode with me. I urge you to listen to it. He's also written a great book on privacy, which I urge you to read. It's a very broad book. It is not just a narrow book on, privacy in India, but a broad book which looks at the history of the subject. And I was super, super impressed by it. So do check that out. Let's talk about now the lessons that you have taken from building this institution. You have a section in one of your chapters called 10 Lessons for Institution Building. Obviously, we want people to buy the book, and of course they will. Should be a bestseller. So I won't ask you to take me through all 10 of these lessons, but just pick a few which speak to you. Share these. Perhaps with personal stories if they exist around them.
Well, I'll hasten to add that these are lessons we have learned. They're not necessarily prescriptions for everybody else. I think if people see something in those lessons that resonate for their personal experience, by all means go for it. But we don't have any great theoretical knowledge of institution building. This is just experience and how things have played out. I'd like to start with what is really the central lesson and perhaps a big motivation for having written the book in the first place, which is that a sharing model, a lockstep, is essentially a model in which you share with others. There are conditions, there are terms, there are tweaks, there are some people will get more, some people will get less, but effectively it's a sharing model. So the principle that really I feel very proud of is that a sharing model can achieve really great commercial success. And if we'd remained a small law firm, a boutique kind of small firm with our model, it would have been a nice little story. It certainly wouldn't have justified a book. And it would have been a tale to tell saying, look, we do things differently and we've made a nice little life for ourselves and we've created a small firm. But to be able to reach the top of the market, with our model, which is a sharing model, gives me great sort of hope for the future of the profession. Because if people want to grow, I don't think you can grow with a top-down approach in today's India anymore in the professional services. You can grow through collaboration and through trust. And those are, when I interviewed our partners for the book, and when I asked, especially laterals, when I asked them about what their experience had been, the word collaboration and trust, the word collaboration in particular, just leapt off the page. Repeatedly, that's what people were saying. And that's what a sharing model does. If you trust that the model will deliver you your fair rewards, then you will collaborate. So that's another one. I think the one important one for me, and as I said earlier, it was because of the lack of it, is to find mentors. We were too proud to go outside and ask too many people for advice, and we felt that it would tarnish our reputation in the market. If people are saying they don't know what they're talking about, they're asking seniors for advice, I would say it doesn't matter. It's not such a big deal. If you have to go and ask someone, that's fine. We used to ask each other internally questions and review each other's work in the early days because we didn't go and ask anyone from outside. So I would encourage people to find mentors, and it needn't be from the profession. It can be just in terms of people who've lived a career trajectory that resonates with you in some way. So I think it's important to have the humility to ask people for advice. And there are many, many people who are very willing to be generous with their time. It's really surprised. It was a surprise to me to see that there are so many people who are happy to put themselves out there and guide folks. So that's another one. So those are two important ones that leap to mind. If you'd read off one or two of the others, then maybe I can say something more about
I'm
them.
going to read them anyway, because even if you don't elaborate, I think they give a taste of what the culture is like and what the book is like. So very profound. I hope random shallow people listening to this don't now create LinkedIn posts out of these, but random shallow people would not have got so far in the podcast, right? So it's fine. No LinkedIn kind of people are listening. Founders create culture but must step back eventually.
Yeah, that was a big lesson. I think that it was probably something we wanted to do, but we possibly did it a bit later than we could have and should have. And that was one of the issues that led to some of the difficulties we had in 2019, where perhaps we could have passed on the reins of leadership a little earlier. But I'm happy that we corrected from it. But there is no question that founders need to step back, because the kind of energy and instincts that founders have are not necessarily the kind of energy and instincts that will carry an organization to the next level. In some cases it might, but there are many examples that dot the tech world in particular where that's not been the case. You've had to bring in a next generation of leader in order to grow the organization, and also to demonstrate that what you say about it not being a closed shop, and otherwise we would have just been a non-family version of a family firm if we'd kept everything to ourselves. So I think you have to also, it's a way to walk the talk.
Culture without structure can only get you so far.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise it's platitudes. It's good feelings, it's instincts, and that's what we learned in 2012. That we thought we had the right culture. Nobody thought that we were bad guys. People liked us, but we were trying to live and execute the culture, implement the culture in a way that was now anachronistic. We needed to move to the next level or next stage of an organization's existence, which was to institutionalize those values through structure.
Find ways to tap into internal initiative.
Oh, that's a great one, because we actually, now we're at a point where we have to find new ways to do that, new and interesting ways to do that. But we've, in the past, a partner who's coming up for partnership, Ajay Raghavan, pitched his partnership on the basis that he would set up an employment law practice. And he was, you said, yeah, we told him go ahead. And he built an employment law practice, and we have the top employment law practice in the country with 6 or 7 partners in it. Extremely profitable, excellent, because excellent for new clients, because very often when a foreign company is coming into India, the first thing they want to do is hire a country head or set up a structure, hire a few people. So that's the tip of the spear, and then of course you tend to do more of their work for them. But we've also used both between Rahul and in the early days and Nikhil Narendran in later days, we've built our whole IT system from the beginning with lawyers' inputs. So the system is much more responsive to the manner in which lawyers use tech, rather than being a tech platform that's imposed on lawyers and then lawyers having to adapt to that. So when we trained our AI system in the early days, there were 800 lawyers who were part of the beta and who contributed feedback to the whole thing.
Yeah, and in fact, that sounds a lot like a product that you could actually sell to law firms everywhere.
Well, it's the actual AI platform's been built by an AI company, which is its own thing. But we helped them train the model so that it would work for us. I'm not sure what the contract with them says, but they're probably allowed to use a version of that with other firms.
Establish trust first, collaboration will follow.
Yeah, I think we briefly touched on this. If you trust the person in front of you as a human being, then you're going to be happy to work with them. And it sort of goes to one of the reasons why we set up the firm in the first place, which was to go into a place of work and feel that your colleagues are pulling in the same direction as you and you're not competing with them. Doesn't mean that some of our partners do not compete with each other. They do. But in general, the competition is healthy. And the unhealthy competition is on the very margin.
You have to balance collegiality and merit continuously.
Yeah, this is a point that has led to us constantly adjusting our partnership model so that we can recognize merit from time to time. Once initially we did it by giving a one-time jump of points. Then we did it through bringing in a bonus system, and we yeah, those are some of the ways in which we've done it. The bonus is also expanded a little bit over time, but it's still very small, because if the bonus is too large, then you start approximating eat what you kill again.
Flexibility enables resilience.
We've adapted a number of times to circumstances, the fact that we've changed our model. And if you for the right reasons, if you're flexible, then you develop the muscle of being able to withstand change whenever it's necessary, and also to recognize when it's necessary.
Transparency works, especially if you play the long game.
We've always shared details of our financials with all the partners. In the book, for the first time, a law firm in India has revealed its numbers. And I say only partly jokingly, when people say, oh, how come you did that? And I said, look, actually, we've been doing it for years, because the minute you tell your own partners the numbers, everybody in the market knows your numbers, because partners speak to their pals and they tell their numbers, tell the firm's numbers to them, partly as bragging rights or whatever. So the reason, and this is a cheeky bit, the reason that other firms don't reveal the numbers to the public is largely because they don't reveal them to their own partners.
Nuts. And your final one was a sharing model, which you elaborated upon, but the one before that is one that actually speaks to me a lot as a creator as well. Persistence doesn't just pay, it compounds.
The principle of compounding is just an amazing one, and there's a whole chapter on the power of compounding and how rapid growth from 2020 to 2025 was a combination of a number of factors, but the basis for it was compounding. The fact that we grew to a certain size, our structure required our partners to make new partners, and therefore when you had a critical mass of partners and they were making new partners, then suddenly one day you get 10, 12 partners, new partners a year. So you're adding 10% to your partnership just like that.
There's a book by Rainer Maria Rilke called Letters to a Young Poet. And I'm going to give you a book idea now. And based on that, I'm going to ask you to go on an impromptu monologue for at least 5 minutes. Letters to a Young Lawyer. Right. So if you had to write a letter to a young lawyer today, let's say some ardent young lawyer who is wooing your daughter. So there is a lot at stake here.
Oh, gosh.
I'm sorry to bring it up. So what would your letters to a young lawyer contain? Your time starts now.
Well, I think that this is going to be a boring old uncle thing to say.
Imagine you're speaking to him. Now you're not speaking to me and telling me what you'll say. You're speaking to him or her or them.
No, don't ask me to do that, Amit, because my daughters already accuse me of being very strict and formal with their boyfriends.
Oh.
So I don't think that tone is a tone that anybody wants to hear. So let me think of it as a nephew who I'm likely to be far more, or a niece. Who I'm likely to be far more solicitous towards.
Address the niece directly.
No, please don't. No,
okay, fine.
My theatre days are over. Okay. So it'd be hard for me to do that. But I think one boring uncle thing to say would be that this is not a profession in which you are going to see immediate gains. It is a profession in which knowledge compounds, in which you need to sort of learn a certain amount, get a certain amount of experience before you can expect for your opinion to be taken consistently seriously. Every now and then your opinion will be taken seriously. I would often tell young lawyers that if you've read a new case on a matter that has been around for a long time and you're the only person who's read it, then you're the expert. So you at that moment know more than me, and that's why you have law firms and not individual lawyers, because then you can share that knowledge and you're more than the sum of your parts. So do not expect immediately to be considered to have a great view and an opinion on something, because you just don't have enough experience to do it. Small anecdote from my early days, which is I was asked by a partner in my London firm to come to a meeting for the day. To attend this meeting and you can work on this deal. So I went along, and at some point I put my hand up and I made a comment, and that was well taken, etc. And in the evening, this partner tells me, "So Akshay, can you please go back and write up your notes?" So I said, "What notes?" So she said, "You were not taking notes all day about what was going on. Why do you think you were in the room? You were there for notes, not to make that one comment that you made." So that was a lesson to me, that sit quiet and listen. Your one comment, other people in the room have probably thought of it. They've got enough experience. But even if they haven't, you have to learn quite a bit before. So don't expect immediate rewards. That's one. Secondly, I would say, do not bother with finding your passion. When you start off your career, don't worry if you're not passionate about it. If you're becoming a lawyer because you think it's a good idea, but you're not passionate, don't worry. If you become really good at something, you will become passionate about it. I didn't never thought that I would be passionate about being an energy and infrastructure lawyer, and about renewable energy, and about government to private contracts, PPP, concession agreements. I never thought that these would be things that I would feel strongly about and feel deeply about and be passionate about. But when I became better at it and got enough experience, I found myself becoming passionate about it because it was inherently interesting. The next thing I'd say is, don't worry about acquiring bookish knowledge, but be really curious about the world within which you are performing your work. I get asked very often by people who are joining the legal profession, say, "I've got 3-4 months to spare. What book should I read?" So I say, read the economic newspapers, read The Economist, and be aware of the world within which you're likely to be practicing law. One of my favorite examples from 20 years ago is I was interviewing this young woman who was very bright, topper, answered all the questions brilliantly. And towards the end of the interview, I said, "So what do you think about the Reliance split?" And she said, "Reliance is split?" And this was 6 months after the Reliance split. So to me, that I could not hire her because she was not interested in the context, or it seemed to me that she was not interested in the context within which her work was being performed, the corporate world. So I think curiosity and knowledge about the world beyond the immediate work that you're going to be doing will be enormously beneficial. Number one. Number two, another thing that I say to younger lawyers is that when you're drafting a due diligence checklist for an IT acquisition, and you're saying it's 10 o'clock at night and it's really boring, and you're saying, "What is this tedious piece of work I'm doing?" The way that I used to feel little more interested in my work, or get out of that feeling of tediousness, is to ask myself, what is this transaction? Why is it happening? Who are the players? What are their corporate strategies? What's happening in the world? Is this happening because of geopolitics? Is tariffs got to do something with it? Is someone setting up a manufacturing facility in a different country because they want to take benefits of some incentives they're being given? If you contextualize it, little boring piece of work will be a little less boring for you, and you'll be more engaged with your work. So that contextualization, I think, is absolutely key. So those are a few things I'd say.
This is brilliant advice. You should certainly write that book. In fact, you can write that book between now and the release of this episode. A slim volume, much like Rilke's book, Letters to a Young Lawyer. Please think about it. And I'm particularly taken by what you mentioned about not following your passion. I keep one of the lessons in life I have come to is that you don't have to do what you love. You just have to love what you do. And so much of the secret towards both excellence and happiness kind of lie there.
Yeah, no one's paying me to be an endurance runner. I'm average at running. I love doing it, but I'm not going to, I don't want to become a running coach. I don't like giving people sort of targeted specific advice on anything. So, I really follow that as a principle.
Because I'm in flow state now, I'm going to suggest another book, Letters to a Young Runner. But yeah, so thanks so much for your time. This is such a wonderful book, such an easy read. Look, ordinarily left to myself, I would never have read a book about a law firm. Like, why would I? But this was very interesting, partly because it's got human stories, and it's it comes from you. You can make out who the writer is. Of course, you didn't want it to be your story. You've spoken to all the partners. You've got all of that. But I love the little taste of you that I got. Is going to be a great web series. Any thoughts on like if you could get any actor from any point in movie history to play you, who would you get?
Oh gosh! Now there's where hubris is going to bubble over, depending on, regardless of what I say.
The kind
actually.
of people who have got to the third hour of the episode are not the judgmental kind of people. Feel free. And I would say that, I asked you this question earlier when we were having lunch, and I thought there is actually no Indian actor as good looking as you are now. Frankly, I don't want to flatter you, but that's really the case. So, but surely across a span of history, we'll find somebody or the other.
Rahul Bose, maybe when he was younger.
Yeah, kind of geeky, but sharp enough. I don't know. But if you say so, I mean, it's you. So, yeah, weirdly, so the thought just comes in my mind that weirdly, the person I thought of on who could actually play you is not even an actor, but a director, Satyajit Ray. Like the feel of the man,
Wow, that's a big compliment.
kind of to you, not to him.
To me, absolutely. No, poor fellow. I mean, yeah.
No. So yeah, Manikda. So my final question, over the last 3 years since we recorded the last episode, what have you been reading? What have you been watching? Recommend for me books, films, music that have brought you joy and you want to share it with the whole world.
The most recent book I read, which is many people have read and is absolutely excellent, is Shattered Lands by Sam Dalrymple. Loved it. I'm also reading alongside it, or rather having finished it, a book called, I think it's called 47 Borders That Changed the World. And it's a similar kind of idea of borders through history. And I'm actually someone who's very suspicious of borders, particularly because they've changed such a lot. So the sense that we get is the borders that we see today are indelible. They've always been like this. There's no reason why they should change. And you realize how recent and how fragile in many ways all of them are. And the subcontinent, it's remarkable that in living in the subcontinent where the borders as we see them today have been formed very recently in historical terms. It's something that interests me a lot. So, that's another book that I've read. I've read a couple of books by David Deutsch, who I think is brilliant. I've read an excellent, A Gentleman in Moscow. Absolutely.
Immortals.
What a writer. I've read more or less everything he's written as a consequence. Great series as well, with Ewan McGregor. That was very good. I don't know if you've seen Mobland.
No.
Mobland is this series with the guy who was also in Peaky Blinders, not Cillian Murphy, but the guy who is the Jewish gang leader. It's got him in it. That was a good series. Then I also watched The Diplomat, which
Tom Hardy.
Tom Hardy, yes. The Diplomat was good. Those are a few series I watched, but I have not been watching a lot of series. I've been, writing and reading a bit more, and otherwise I watch the 1 or 2 Liverpool games every week.
Last year was great. What do you feel about this year? Do you want Alonso back, or you want Slot to continue?
I think I'd want Slot to continue for this season, certainly. And if it starts picking up, I think he's a good manager. He wouldn't have won the last title if he wasn't. And I think it's not in the Liverpool tradition to sack managers so easily. But you're in a performance culture, and one of the greatest players of recent history of the club is available. So it would be tempting for the club, I think, to switch.
No, and also, a week is a long time in football, and there'll actually be 3 months, 3 months before this episode comes out. Like just in the last week of football, if you've been following it, you've had Maresca sacked from Chelsea, Amorim sacked from United, and now Alonso from Real Madrid. And you by the time this episode airs, God knows what will happen. But I like Slot a lot. I like his demeanor and the way he talks frankly about tactics so openly in his post-match conferences. But
music-wise, I continue to be in awe of Fontaine's DC, which is his Dublin band, which has got a sound which is incredible. It's slightly reminiscent of Joy Division in some ways, not so much in the sound, but in the manner in which they are different. And I've heard them live a couple of times, and they are fantastic in concert. Yeah, and I go to this every year. There's this concert in Paris, or the festival in Paris called Rock en Seine, which is a pun on rock on the Seine River, but rock on the stage. Seine is stage. And me and a pal of mine, we go every year for at least one of the 4-5 days. And heard Nick Cave and PJ Harvey and Kraftwerk and all sorts of interesting bands there. So I just have a very eclectic taste in music, but I have always listened to a lot of trip hop. And it's not necessarily new music, but from the days of Massive Attack onwards, trip hop, things like Saint Germain, Kruder and Dorfmeister, Tosca, these kinds of bands, they're sort of the soundtrack of my life in some ways. If I go for a run and I listen to Tosca, I have a good run.
Wow, I can't wait to check out some of this. I guess when you go to Rock on the Seine,
yeah,
you must have an insane time there.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, taken my daughters a couple of times as well.
Awesome. Akshay, thanks so much for spending the whole afternoon with me. I know you guys do billable hours and all kinds of terrible things, and great privilege to have you on the show again.
Thanks a lot. It was a great chat as always.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will, head on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and pick up Akshay's fine book, Trilegal. Even if you have no interest in the legal profession, you'll love the book. There's a lot to learn from it. And since I mentioned heading on over to bookstores, if you're in Bangalore, please head on over to Bookworm, buy this book, buy other books, support them. They've been through a tough time. You can follow Akshay on Twitter at Akshay Jaitley2. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Verma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.